Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, new reporting on how President Trump wants to alter the Iran deal.
I would rather get a deal because we can open the Strait immediately upon signing. The one guarantee that I have to have is that there will be no nuclear weapons.
What he's saying now about nuclear capabilities, the Strait, and gas prices.
Plus, a journalist who visited the Ebola Epicenter joins us live. What he saw and heard in a hospital ward in a mining town in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where he writes, the virus has been spreading virtually unimpeded.
And meeting the Gen Zers who would rather hit the gym than the club.
And they're also looking for community and places that they can't find at the bar.
What's driving the trend among young people to spend more of their money on a different kind of fun?
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York City. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, May 31st. Welcome to our listeners and viewers across all Bloomberg platforms, radio, TV, Bloomberg.com, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Continuing to kind of piece together what happened, Christina, in the Situation Room on Friday. I don't want to call it a slow news weekend because we've had so much news coming out of the Shangri-La dialogue that's been taking place in Singapore. A lot of focus on the Middle East, focus on what's going on in Europe and Asia as well. But still a great mystery, an unsolved mystery here, how the president went from saying he was going to give us a final determination on this Iran deal to crickets to nothing.
That's right. But we've got our Jeff Mason is here in New York, and he's going to help us try to solve that mystery. We're also going to go through some other key races and elections, both domestically here in the U.S. and around the world, including Colombia. And we're going to talk about California. And we're going to talk about some interesting innovations in tech, from SpaceX down to what it means to build those huge data centers and who the winners and losers are when you put one of those in a neighborhood that doesn't really have the infrastructure for it.
Incredibly busy morning. We'll get to all of that. But first, let's get to the headlines with Lisa Mateo. Lisa?
You got it. Well, the U.S. has a firm that deals with Iran to safely sail through the Strait of Hormuz. Even those which don't involve paying a toll are not allowed. That's according to an updated statement from the U.S. Treasury. The White House has sent conflicting messages on the prospects for an agreement with Iran. In an interview on Fox, President Trump said he's in no hurry for a deal, and if the U.S. doesn't get what it's asking for, we will end it in a different way. Now, this comes as ship owners say they're optimistic about a pickup in traffic through the Strait thanks to help from the U.S. They say they've been in touch with American military forces who are not escorting the ships, but are rather advising them on how the best way to navigate the waterway. Well, back here at home, protests continue outside Delaney Hall Immigration Detention Center in Newark, New Jersey. State police, well, they've set up designated protest zones and vehicle checkpoints in the area. Clashes between demonstrators and federal immigration enforcement agents, they have intensified. Governor Mikey Sherrill says it's grown unsafe, adding that people from the outside of the state have been escalating this situation. This woman explained why she showed up.
I am very worried for the state of our country. I am a patriot. I support the Constitution. I support democracy. And I support the freedom to speak, the freedom to gather, the freedom to live. And without having to worry that you're going to get kidnapped off the street.
Newark Mayor Ross Baraka has ordered a mandatory curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. for about a half-mile surrounding Delaney Hall. Well, today, security will be tight in New York City as the Israel Day Parade kicks off on Fifth Avenue later this morning. The NYPD says there will be uniformed and plainclothes officers along the route, as well as counterterrorism teams, explosive detections, helicopters, drones, and K-9 mounted units as well. A record turnout is expected. Not attending the parade, Mayor Zohran Mamdani. NYPD Commissioner Jessica Tisch, she will be the Grand Marshal. And President Trump calling for the cancellation of a concert series celebrating the nation's 250th birthday this summer after a number of musicians pulled out. Now, in a Truth Social post, he said, quote, "We should have a giant Make America Great Again rally for 250 instead of having overpriced singers who nobody wants to hear." Now, this comes after another post by the president suggesting that he should instead headline the event, calling himself, quote, "the man who gets much larger audiences than Elvis in his prime." David and Christina.
Elvis in his prime.
Yes.
Well,
bigger audiences.
There's a parallel, an historical analog.
I fear I've made a terrible mistake on one of Lisa's other stories. I somehow managed to move right on every parade route in New York.
You do live on the parade route. We don't want to reveal too much.
No, that's all I'm going to say. But
it's
been it's
going to be tough getting.
And it's always because we go home from work right at the peak of these parades. Well, it's always a little hard to.
We'll look for you
to access my building. If I knock on either of your doors, it's because I've been unable to get to mine.
If you're knocking on my door, you've gone too far.
Don't worry, I'm not going to Brooklyn or Jersey. Wait, Brooklyn and Jersey. Wait a minute. Never mind. I take it back. All right. Okay. Thank you, Lisa. All right, there are new details this morning about President Trump's meeting in the Situation Room on Friday. Axios is reporting the president is asking for several edits to a deal negotiated between his envoys and the Iranian regime.
In particular, the president wants to strengthen the sections around Iran's nuclear material, including details on how the U.S. gets that material and when. Here's what he told his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, on Fox News last night.
This is really a win already. We've defeated their military, essentially defeated their military. I would rather get a deal because we can open the Strait immediately upon signing. The one guarantee that I have to have is that there will be no nuclear weapons. They've agreed to that. And it was very interesting. They originally said, we will not develop a nuclear weapon. I said, well, what happens if you buy a nuclear weapon? So now it says we will not develop or in any way purchase a military weapon. That's a big difference. So we're getting what we want slowly. Very tough negotiators. It takes a long time. I'm in no hurry. I'd like to say I'm in a hurry because, gasoline prices are going to come tumbling down. But if you're going to be in a hurry, you're not going to make a good deal.
President, on My View with his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump. Joining us now, Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Bloomberg News, and Dana Kraish, Bloomberg's UAE bureau chief. Jeff, great to have you with us here in New York, as always. Let's start with that meeting. I mentioned at the top of the show so much mystery surrounding what unfolded, of course, over those 2 hours and why there wasn't a resolution that was promised by the president. As you've been talking to sources, piecing all of this together, what are the stumbling blocks? You heard from the president there. The red lines remain the same. The rhetoric remains the same. Iran can't have a nuclear weapon, et cetera. Where is there kind of room for negotiation between these two sides, as you see?
And I wish, David, that I had the magic answer for what happened on Friday. I think it is interesting to note that interview with his daughter-in-law that aired on Fox.
Conversation.
The conversation is probably a better thing to call that. Was taped before the situation.
Oh, really?
That was as far as I know, that was taped on Thursday. So not fully even up to date right then. Not a hard-hitting interview anyway, but interesting because the president does share a lot of his views when he talks to Fox, be it his daughter-in-law or someone else.
Yeah.
That said, you're absolutely right that basically it's in a holding pattern, and it's interesting because the president started off, was it last weekend on a Saturday, by saying we've got a deal, we're going to let the details out shortly. That was a Saturday. On Sunday he pulled back, and basically that whole week we've been waiting for more.
There is a Ned Ryersonian quality to all of this.
Yeah, and there's a Groundhog Day quality.
There you go.
Right? Because
Deja vu all over
the
again.
president has a lot of competing interests here. He obviously wants to get out of this war. He's got a lot of political reasons for that. But he, as the deal maker in chief and as the guy who sort of built both a business and a political career on being a deal maker, he doesn't want it to come out and be one that isn't great. And there are plenty of Republicans who are worried that that's exactly what he's going to do.
Dana, I want to ask you about the state of play. The president contradicted himself a bit in those remarks. I want to play some sound for you and then get your reaction as somebody who's in the region.
Their Navy is totally gone, 100%. Their Air Force is totally gone, 100%. Their military, we've sort of left it alone because we think that their military is somewhat moderate. They have other people that aren't moderate. We've taken them out. We've taken different forms of leadership out. We've actually left their military alone. People would be surprised to hear that because mistakes have been made in wars where you wipe out everybody and then you have a country that's, for 40 years can never rebuild.
It's a little unclear what the president means here because he says the Navy has gone 100%, the Air Force has gone 100%, but we've left the military alone. Maybe giving him the benefit out, maybe he's talking about some of the leadership structure there, not the physical. But when it comes to Iran's capability to still strike harm, especially among regional allies, one of the things that hasn't been discussed as much as the nuclear and the Strait is their ballistic missile program, which, of course, was how it damaged all those countries around Iran at the start of this war. Do we have any idea what Iran's capacity is left? Can they still strike harm, and can they still damage U.S. allies in the region if this deal does truly fall apart?
I think it's not just about ballistic missiles. The damage that was done to a lot of the even energy infrastructure here in the region was caused by the drones, the really infamous now Shahed drones, and they've struck energy infrastructure in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, and civilian infrastructure as well. I think the concern here is more about drones, and that's why we saw Ukraine president visiting Saudi, visiting UAE, trying to lobby for his own technology to counter and deter those drones. So drones remain a concern for the region here. And we saw not even Iran's own capability, but let's remember that 2 weeks ago, it was Iraqi militias aligned with Iran that targeted the UAE's only operating nuclear power plant here in Abu Dhabi. So it isn't just about Iran's own capability, but the capability of its proxies, be it in Iraq and those militias there that have also targeted Kuwait, and of course, those in Lebanon, that's now where the war is raging. I think the concern is everything from the ballistic missiles and the drones and how to counter those.
That's a very good point. Yeah, I forget. I don't forget about the drones, but in my head, I think of them as like under that umbrella, but you're not. You're right. They're a very different thing. And we're going to talk a little bit later about Ukraine and President Zelensky and how he is making new pathways through the Middle East, partly because of that drone technology.
Jeff, let me ask you about the Strait and the president's tack toward it, reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, there's been so much conversation surrounding how that might resolve itself, what countries might pursue some sort of tolling agreement or tariff agreement with Iran. Let's hear what the president had to say about that during that conversation with Lord Trump, as you say, recorded on Thursday.
The Strait has to be opened immediately and has to be free, no tolls, et cetera, et cetera. And number two is they can't have a nuclear weapon. That's all there is. It's very simple. And then we're going to get out of there. And we don't need the Strait. You know, we don't need it because we have more. So we produce now, because of us, we produce more oil than Saudi Arabia and Russia combined ×2. Think of that. We'd double what they do. Add Saudi Arabia and Russia, multiply it ×2, and we're going to be much higher. We're the oil superpower.
Jeff, talk a bit about this, because this is the one thing that the president really can't jawbone. The fact that, yes, we're an oil superpower, but of course it's a global market, and his frustration is palpable over the fact that oil prices, gas prices are directionally going in one way. They're going up. They have gone up since the start of this conflict. Talk a bit about how, if at all, his tack toward the Strait is evolving in light of that.
Well, let's fact check a couple things that he said there. He says, number one, that we, as in the United States, we don't need the Strait. Well, that's not entirely true, largely because of what you just said. It's a global oil market. So even if the United States has a bunch of its own oil production, which he's very proud of, that doesn't help the gas prices writ large for this country because it's impacted by the rest of the world. Number two, the political reality is this was not an issue before the war. Iran has learned through this war that it has the leverage of the Strait of Hormuz. And so he wants to reset that, but clearly is having some trouble getting the Iranians to just go back on something that they have learned is something that they can use. So trying to get that sort of go back in time to some extent with a deal and achieve a nuclear deal is proven to be a really tough lift.
Dana, you mentioned this just a second ago, but I do want to circle back to what's going on in Lebanon, because it is both part of this negotiation. Obviously, the Iranians want a ceasefire in Lebanon to be part of that deal. Unclear if that's going to happen or not. But
and unclear if it's one of those 14 points on the 14-point plan. I mean, yeah, I think it's important.
Also true. Yeah, also true, whether it's even included in this aspirational MOU. But there is some news in Lebanon today. The Israeli army has captured this strategic castle, and it's the deepest incursion into that territory in 26 years. What is happening there, and does it show any signs of secession or ceasefire is way too much to say, but what is going on and why this action and why today?
So yes, the Israeli army has expanded the ground operation that it started back 2 months ago into Lebanon. And like you said, they have seized a strategic ridge, which is the Beaufort Ridge, and that oversees the Galilee, which is a lot of the northern community in Israel, which have come under fire from Hezbollah. Hezbollah has really upped its attacks on these Israeli communities in the north and Israeli troops inside Lebanon, inside the so-called yellow zone, which is technically an occupation zone where Israeli troops are along the border, along the Israeli-Lebanese border. And this is could be a problem for the US and the Iranians. Iran has always said that part of any deal with the US, it should ensure a halt to all conflicts in the region, primarily the one in Lebanon, because it's a war, basically on Hezbollah. Hezbollah is Iran's most powerful proxy and the proxy that's proven most useful to the Iranians. Hezbollah engaged into this war, entered the war on Iran when the US and Israeli struck Tehran and killed, of course, the former supreme leader. And the first attack by Hezbollah was to avenge Khamenei. And that just proves how close they are to the Iranians, how linked religiously and militarily to the Iranians. And they didn't stop ever since. Now, we should kind of separate that from what is happening in the US as well. The US is sponsoring very rare talks between Lebanon, as the government, of course, and Israel on how to end the crisis. Lebanon insists on a full cessation of hostilities from the Israeli side. And of course, Israel wants to guarantee that Hezbollah is completely uprooted from the southern region along the border. Yeah. So there is no sign of stopping here. Both parties, Israel and Hezbollah, are exchanging fire. Israel is trying to push deeper into South Lebanon to strike a major blow for Hezbollah once again. It is weaker, might I say, like politically, militarily, but still it is there and it poses a risk to Israel. So this is all up in the air. It's a very fluid situation and could become an obstacle in the talks between the US and Iran.
Very important point.
Jeff, I want to turn to you lastly as we look for detail on, yes, the status of this memo of understanding, but other things as well. The president has been posting up a storm, I think it's fair to say, 50 tweets or posts over the course of the last 24 hours. And I'm reminded of what Daniel Kurtzleben of NPR reported a few weeks back. This is a president who still does this, but it has less resonance than it did maybe during his first term. What do you make of what he's tweeting about? It's about the Kennedy Center no longer being the Trump Kennedy Center.
The America 250.
The America 250 celebration. There is a lot that's rankling him right now, and we get the clearest sense of that through his social media posts still.
I would sum it up by saying he's actually having a tough week. I mean, he does not have the deal that he wanted. He does not have the news that he wanted to goose markets, although I think we could spend an entire hour talking about how and why markets are reading into some of the things that he's saying and the way that they are. The Kennedy Center is a huge blow. I mean, and they will probably appeal it, but I thought it was unusual on Friday that he
seemed to kind of capitulate on that.
He threw his hands up, which is not the way that the president usually reacts to a not beneficial court ruling. So that's a big vanity project for him. He's not getting everything done with the ballroom that he wants, although he says he's pressing ahead. And this 250th anniversary, he's super excited about that, right? I mean, there's talk, of course, of him putting his face on a $250 bill, and then people are pulling out of this concert, so he's offering to headline it himself. I think all of that comes down to things are not moving in the direction that he wants.
$250 coin. Bill? We'll see.
I think it's down to
Scott
a coin
Bessent,
now,
the
right?
Treasury Secretary,
I think they said they couldn't do a bill, so I think now they're trying to do a coin.
Pretty expensive coin.
Jeff Mason, Dana Krejci for us overseas. Thank you both so much. And up next, we're going to go to Bunia in the Democratic Republic of Congo to discuss what one reporter saw inside an Ebola ward. That's straight ahead on Bloomberg This Weekend on all your platforms, streaming, radio, Bloomberg.com, and of course, the Bloomberg Business app.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Donald Trump says he would like to get a deal done with Iran, but he's in no hurry. In an interview on Fox News, he mentioned a few sticking points.
The one guarantee that I have to have is that there will be no nuclear weapons. They've agreed to that. And it was very interesting. They originally said, we will not develop a nuclear weapon. I said, well, what happens if you buy a nuclear weapon? So now it says we will not develop or in any way purchase a military weapon.
Trump said that if the U.S. doesn't get what it wants, we will end it in a different way. Well, 5 villagers have been rescued from a flooded cave in Laos after being trapped underground for over a week. Today, heavy rains, they threaten to delay the search for 2 more people still missing. The 7 villagers entered the cave last week to look for minerals, but were trapped by flash flooding. To the Ebola outbreak now, where the head of the World Health Organization expressed some optimism while visiting eastern Congo.
Ebola, caused by the Bundibugyo virus, can be survived with good medical care, and some people here in Italy have already recovered. Seeking care early makes a real difference.
The health organization said Friday that the latest official figures, well, it shows more than 900 suspected cases and over 200 suspected deaths. David and Christina, over to you.
Lisa, thank you very much. Appreciate that update. And again, we're continuing to track this over the course of the last couple of weekends and eager to get a perspective on the ground.
Yeah, lots of different perspectives. I think because Ebola is it's just so scary and intense. And as Lisa said, the outbreak continues to worsen overseas. New York Times chief Africa correspondent Declan Walsh has been reporting what this outbreak looks like live on the ground in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Take a listen.
When we walked into this Ebola ward, it was very striking that in this confined space, you had a grown man being treated, you had this young child who just arrived, and you had a person who had died of Ebola lying in that same space. The hospital doesn't even have the resources to feed patients. People's relatives have to come to the Ebola ward just to bring them bottles of water and food.
Declan Walsh joins us now from Bunia, the capital of the Ituri province in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is the epicenter of this Ebola outbreak. It's great to speak with you, Declan. Thank you very much for being here. We see you in that video. You're wearing a Tyvek suit. You have PPE. It's clear that those visiting patients in that medical facility do not have Tyvek suits or PPE. Can you just talk about the capacity of this hospital to deal with what is still a nascent outbreak in the DRC?
That particular hospital was, I would say, completely overwhelmed when we arrived. It's the main public hospital in a gold mining town called Mongwalu, that's about 50 miles north of here. That's where this outbreak is believed to have started as long as 2 months ago. And when we arrived there, frankly, the public health facilities appeared to be in crisis. As you see, there was only protective equipment for medical staff like doctors, but otherwise those wards were not secured. There was very minimal care being given to patients. And then you had relatives and other folk just walking in and out, and they seemed to be entirely unprotected. And of course, that was putting them at great risk and of course increasing the possibility that the hospital itself would be a source of transmission back out into the community.
Yeah, it looks, I mean, it makes sense now that you're saying that's the general hospital, because it looks to me like TB wards I've been in places. It doesn't look like a purpose-built facility, which I guess is part of the problem. I do want to ask you briefly how you got there, and then David was pointing out to me earlier this morning that you said that you hadn't really planned on going in to this extent. Why did you change your mind once you were on the ground?
We were there for several days. We'd spoken with the medical staff, got their permission. We got the permission from the patients to enter that ward, and you know, I just felt it was very important to witness firsthand and to show the reality of care in the Congo, particularly in this frontline area. Here in the main city, Bunia, the head of the WHO has been here the last couple of days. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus. There are, aid agencies are present here. There's certainly some supplies coming in. I was at the opening of a new isolation ward in the city this morning. But up there in those rural areas where the greatest number of cases are found, for a whole combination of factors, it's extremely difficult. Very little aid has reached there so far. And, they're in a crisis situation, which of course is bad, terrible news for the people who are already sick. But it also means that the spread of this virus is frankly unknown and probably still uncontained.
Declan, something we've spoken about with Jeremy Conondike, public health official from the U.S., with Tom Frieden, former head of the CDC, as well as just about the cultural difficulties here, conveying to the population the seriousness of this outbreak. And you point to something very worrisome in your piece. You say many refused to accept the virus was real. You continue, some said the outbreak was a money-making plot concocted by Congolese doctors and foreign aid workers. Others call it a curse. As we talk about the deficit in the public health response to this crisis, how acute is this problem in particular, just conveying to the population how dangerous this is and trying to explain in light of those sense of what's happening here that in fact is not the case? This is a very serious virus.
It's an absolutely crucial point. When you speak to aid workers, the first thing they'll tell you is they need equipment. The second thing they'll say they need is education and engagement with these communities. Some of these communities are extremely hostile to the virus. It's not just, to the idea of the virus. It's not just that they don't believe it exists. They have carried out attacks against hospitals. The hospital that I visited had an isolation ward that was under construction, burned down. It came under attack the first night we were there from a group of over 100 people who wanted to retrieve the body of a local spiritual leader who had just died of Ebola. And what that all gets to is the whole practice of funerals. I think, as you noted, the body of a person is most contagious at the last stages of the disease and after they have died. So how the dead are buried is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, funerals can turn into super spreader events. So you see these really courageous local health workers and Red Cross officials who are doing their best to educate people to try and carry out safe burials of bodies. But because, frankly, the effort is so far behind the curve, as I said, this outbreak is thought to have started probably 6 weeks, maybe 2 months ago, but was only discovered and declared 2 weeks ago. So the entire effort is far behind the curve, which means there's very little reliable data about how much it has spread. And that's only feeding into this suspicion among local communities who, as far as they're concerned, see people going into hospitals just to die.
Declan, I also want to ask you, I want to focus on something you talk about because you report that the hospital has no food or water to give to ailing patients. This is consistently an issue with healthcare in places like this. I know when you're giving HIV medication, when you're giving tuberculosis medication, when you're giving supportive care, that supportive care can't work if your patient is malnourished or you don't have clean water. And it's often the part of the response that it seems to get lost in the shuffle. Are there any efforts being made to address that piece of this? What is needed and where do you think it should be coming from?
Look, certainly the World Food Programme have mobilized in this area. They're mounting feeding programs and so on. But, there are two issues with that. Firstly, as you say, in a hospital like this, they just don't generally, for normal treatment, provide food or water to patients.
The families are generally responsible for bringing food to their patients, right? Yeah.
They come in, they provide the food. Now, that is providing a biosecurity hazard in this environment because family members come in unprotected to provide food to people and run a high risk of being contaminated themselves. The other issue is in terms of people's ability to fight this virus. Because this virus it's a rare virus that as yet has no vaccine and no cure, the only way to treat it really is to bolster the defenses of a person who is sick in order that their own body can fight that virus. And obviously food, water, IV drips, all of these very basic, not even medical treatments, but certainly basic things to bolster their immune system are key. And that's why if the medical authorities are going to successfully start to push back this wave of infections, they're going to have to get those pieces in places as well.
Yeah.
Declan, let me ask you lastly just about what you heard from that Congolese doctor with whom you spent the most time. And I think in circumstances like this, past outbreaks, the frustration and exhaustion are palpable among the medical staff who are in facilities like this one. How would you assess his level of optimism that this is going to get under control? And indeed, what does he need, or what does he say that he needs going forward?
I think firstly, he just wanted protective equipment for the staff. Secondly, he wanted to be able to secure that hospital so that they could work in a safe environment. When I met that man in the ward, the young doctor, he was just not just exhausted. He'd just come off a night shift where someone had died during the night. A lady fell into a coma and died. But he really felt like he was at the end of his tether. He said, we're almost 2 weeks into this crisis and this is all we have. How is it possible that both my own government, but also this international system that has, deployed to so many of these Ebola emergencies, he was basically saying, why is that not here? And that kind of frustration is palpable among many of the healthcare professionals you meet in some of these frontline areas.
Declan Walsh, New York Times Chief Africa Correspondent, joining us from the DRC. Thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you to you and your crew, and frankly, whatever editor signed off and allows you to do this on-the-ground reporting, which we know is getting harder and harder to do. So thank you, truly. Thank you to all of you this morning.
This weekend, Ukrainian drones struck a port and oil depot in southern Russia. This came just days after a Russian drone hit a Romanian apartment building.
We spoke to Bloomberg's chief European correspondent to talk about that strike as well as where things stand with this war.
This happened in the dead of night on Thursday evening, and as you say, it's one drone we understand that crossed into Romanian airspace. This is really at the part of the sort of map where the south of Moldova, Ukraine, and Romania all meet, and it sort of crossed about 10 miles in, hit an apartment building, started a fire, injured 2 people. It's sort of different from many of the other incursions or other scares that we've had with airspace because there have actually been casualties, 2 people who have been injured from this. We've heard from EU officials, we've seen who've called this sort of an escalation. We've heard from the Romanians who say, you know, it's totally unacceptable. And of course, there's going to be a big consultation process in terms of what to do next. And as you mentioned, I mean, I remember in the first year of the war, the first time we really had a story like this, it was a few missiles that had crossed into Polish territory, had actually blown up in Poland. And there was a real question of, does this trigger Article 5? Does this get into some very, very uncomfortable positions about a much larger scale war? It turned out to be Ukrainian air defense that were trying to shoot out Russian munitions. But these are the kinds of conversations that are constantly ongoing. And as far as the Kremlin, you know, we know from Russian media, they say that Putin is aware of this, but that's the only comment we've heard from the Russians thus far.
That's really interesting. I also wonder, you know, you had these remarks from Macron lately talking about using literally possibly the nuclear option to keep Russia at bay. Is that a result of, as these attacks start to encroach, as this war continues, and as the U.S. looks like a less reliable member, and questions arise about whether or not this president in the U.S. would really back an Article 5 action, Europe trying to find ways with the capacity they have right now to push back, should they need to, against Russia?
Yeah, so it's very much about Donald Trump, his commitment to NATO, and really sort of getting through some sort of Plan B, some Plan B options, because the Europeans, broadly speaking, have all lived under the American nuclear umbrella for the last several decades. And the only sort of nation within Europe that really has a full sovereign control over their nuclear arsenal is France. Of course, the UK has weapons. They're dependent on the United States in order to be able to deploy them. The French nuclear umbrella is really the only fully robust sovereign European umbrella. So there have been some very, again, uncomfortable discussions. And this was after Macron gave this big speech in a big sort of hall with this nuclear submarine in the north of France. And there are now very active discussions between France and other neighboring countries in the EU about deploying potentially French nuclear weapons on a rotational basis with a number of different countries. So, of course, this is all about, you know, safeguarding European defense and trying to get that deterrence off. No one wants to talk about it as a sort of Plan B. They talk about it sort of in addition to the nuclear umbrella of the United States, because you don't want to scare off the United States. But this is the very present concern within the leaders of Europe.
Were you surprised to see, I mean, to your point, it did seem like quite a few nations were willing to have that discussion with France, more than, frankly, I had expected. Were you surprised, or given where everything was, is that just the next natural step, as you're also seeing the U.S. kind of pull back these troop deployments? You've got the president talking about pulling troops out of Germany, possibly Poland, but then he seems to have done about face there. It's just really, really uncertain. And I know the Europeans are gearing up and trying to contribute more to their defense, but they're not there yet. And is that why this seems to be a viable, as you said, maybe not Plan B, but C and a backstop?
I think that if you had asked them about a year ago, you know, in the early stages of the Trump presidency, they probably wouldn't have been able to sign up to it, wouldn't have done so publicly, wouldn't have talked as openly about it. But I think that after having been tested for a year and a half in terms of what this Trump foreign policy looks like, what it looks like when it comes to NATO, all the great discomfort we've had over the last year and a half over the question of Greenland, there has been basically no alternative. There needs to be a more open and frank discussion. And many of the people that you interview, many of the defense ministers I've spoken to, foreign ministers that I speak to, a lot of people don't want to say these parts out loud because, again, you don't want to upset the Trump administration. That's kind of the catch-22 they're in, but there's a certain point you just can't ignore it. And when it comes to defense and security, what is more important to that? And I think that that's the point that they got to, these European leaders, and having to face that reality finally.
To that end, you also had Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky saying this week to the EU that half membership, partial membership is not enough, given how much Ukraine is contributing to the defense of Europe. How was that received?
Yeah, so this is a really complex debate in terms of how Ukraine gets into the European Union. And there are so many layers of politics on this, because obviously there are other countries that are also in line ahead of Ukraine. Some member states of the European Union want them to be able to sort of leapfrog them and sort of get in there because there's much more urgency. Of course, there's some pushback then from others. Of course, bringing in a nation to the European Union that is currently actively at war comes with all of its other issues. So there were these sort of ideas of potentially associate membership, which would give you some of the privileges of being part of the EU. You would attend attend all of the sort of meetings. You could have access to some of the funding. Potentially they can do something with the sort of single market to try to boost the Ukrainian economy. And there would obviously be some advantages to that. But what we've heard from President Zelensky is saying, listen, we don't want to do any half measures here. And you can get into some of the reasons of why that is. I think that one of the main ones, and this is sort of speculation on my part, but I think it's sort of sound in terms of the reasoning, is that he doesn't want to be stuck in this limbo where you get this sort of Ukraine's partial membership. It stays like that for years and years and years. He said, listen, we've put all of this out here. The Europeans refer to us as the sort of steel porcupine that sits between Russia and the European Union. For him, he's thinking not just about the next couple of years and being able to conduct this war and the economic benefit of partial membership. He's thinking about the decades to come in which orbit the Ukrainians will set into the future. And I think he's willing to bet all of that in getting full EU membership.
Yeah, I'd imagine especially as NATO membership looks more complicated because of those Article 5 complications, because it's hard enough to join the EU with a nation at war, but with Ukraine actively at war, even supporters of Ukraine are reticent to give them full membership in NATO at this moment. I do want to ask you about how the war is going. This is the first week I've seen multiple analysts, watchers of this conflict, start to say that it's possible Ukraine actually has the upper hand. I don't know if that's accurate, but I do want to play you some sound from our colleague David Gura's interview with David Petraeus.
We have not remotely learned all the lessons we should have from the war in Ukraine. That is the future of war right now. It's a war in which one side alone, Ukraine, is using 10,000 drones a day. 90% of the casualties on the Russian side are caused by drones. Tanks can't maneuver anymore. They can't survive. Armored vehicles, you can't even drive vehicles in the death zone, which is 35 kilometers on either side of the front lines, which aren't even lines anymore because drones can fly into trenches and kill people.
So I want to ask you, when it comes to Ukraine's drone technology and what they have been able to do in this conflict, is it a game changer? And is it a game changer when it comes to what the potential settlement will be at some point between these two nations?
I mean, it's completely a game changer. I mean, it is the new face of warfare. And I think for all of the objections that the United States has in terms of supporting Ukraine and this, that, and the other, the United States obviously has been active in this conflict in some sort of more tacit ways. It certainly is gaining a huge amount of knowledge and data about what's going on the ground. And of course, the future of warfare really is all about these drones and interconnected systems. So for the United States, it's also been sort of immensely valuable to learn all of those things. I think that in terms of the war and where we are right now, again, we sort of go from month to month, where the Russians have initiative, the Ukrainians have some initiative. It does seem now that the Ukrainians have sort of regained some of the initiative on the battlefield. The question is, what bearing will that have on sort of diplomacy? You've also seen the Ukrainians having a much more aggressive attack when it comes to striking within Russia, hitting oil refineries. You'll remember some of those attacks that came near and into Moscow. And again, this is a difficult thing for the Russians because it's very, very public when you can get that close to the capital of Moscow. And kind of this sort of tacit agreement between Putin and the elites is that, you're not really going to be affected by this war. And when Zelensky sort of brings the war to the capital and to their front door, that makes things a lot more uncomfortable for Putin. And as a consequence, you see retaliation. You see a great deal of barrage by the Russians. And you have Zelensky saying that they're bracing for a massive attack from the Russians. But also at the same time, in the background, you're getting all of these conversations, strange conversations about possible diplomacy. Even Putin himself at some point was saying that, maybe there could be a European envoy. It might be the former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who's really very Russian aligned, so it was sort of dismissed by the Europeans out of hand. But it's not a completely unserious suggestion. So you have some of these sort of conflicting things where on the one side you do feel like the military side is ramping up, and yet in the background you do have some of these conversations that could be interpreted as making sort of some kind of progress on the diplomatic front.
Before I let you go quickly, what is the mood inside Russia? I am also reading and hearing more that, to your point, the elites, the people around Putin are starting to finally feel the repercussions of this war. At some point, does he feel this pressure? What is it like inside the Kremlin right now?
I mean, here's the difficulty is that in this sort of realm, we go into, a great deal of speculation. Yeah. So, I can't say with any great authority that I really know. There has been some reporting about some of the difficulties that there have been within Russia, particularly, and this is one thing that a lot of the people I speak to point to, was the sort of shutting off of the internet that has happened periodically throughout Moscow. And one of the people I was speaking to actually today, who is a former journalist who spent a long time in Russia, a long time in Moscow, was saying that the Russians really enjoy their personal freedom, and they've given up a lot of political freedom in order to enjoy that. And if you see that personal freedom starting to get restricted, then you maybe potentially see a little bit more pressure mounting within Russia.
And even small business, I was reading, you can't use WhatsApp, you can't sell your goods, you can't just function in the city. I think it's going to be really interesting to watch, and hopefully you'll come back and tell us more about it. Oliver Crook, thank you so much for taking the time.
With pleasure.
Elon Musk's SpaceX is on track for an historic initial public offering in the coming weeks, but investors may already be cooling on that $2 trillion valuation. That's according to Bloomberg's latest reporting ahead of that highly anticipated IPO.
Benedict Campbell is Bloomberg's managing editor for space and aviation, and he joins us now. Hey, thank you. Nice to see you again, although you didn't get to come in this time. We appreciate you zooming in. Look, Bloomberg, as David mentioned, had this exclusive reporting that the SpaceX is now targeting a slightly lower $1.8 trillion, and I can't believe that's lower than anything, valuation. And we need to say Elon Musk denied the drop in valuation on X, of course, calling it false. But why the change here?
Well, we are sort of in the phase where they're trying to figure out where this will go. And to be honest, 1.8 trillion versus 2 trillion, or north of 2 trillion, that's almost a rounding error, you could say. So these numbers are pretty, bonkers if you look at them. They came out with the listing a week ago, and that's really where they pulled the curtain back on sort of a lot of the numbers, and they are really out there. So I think what we are seeing now is the managing banks going to investors, getting a feel from the market, what is the demand out there, and what they'll be seeing is that they're lowballing it, that you're coming in, you're managing expectations, and maybe you're coming in with a slightly lower expectation, and then you blow that out of the water. So that might well be what's going on right now. You don't want to overpromise and then underdeliver. Probably you want to go the other way. So that might well be where we are right now. Who knows where it'll settle? We'll find out in the next couple of days. So the sequence of events in the next couple of days is that we will get sort of the range. That's likely on the 4th of June. And then the actual price is fixed on the 10th. And then the actual trading starts on the 11th. So you're going to see a lot of jockeying in the next couple of days on this, where it'll actually fall. But as you said, Musk himself came out with that single word, denial, if you want to call it that. Call it false, but there's still lots of time left. It might not seem that much, but a lot can happen in the next week.
Danny, let me ask you about the $75 billion figure. That is how much this company intends to raise, and we've talked a lot in recent days just about how this company's become something of a conglomerate. Yes, it shoots rockets into the air and has aspirations of going to the moon and Mars beyond that, but it's also involved in satellites and AI and all manner of things that Elon Musk is interested in.
Starlink, yeah.
What do we know of what becomes of that $75 billion, of why the company is doing this and needs to do it right now?
Well, the company has one business that is extremely cash thirsty, and that is their AI operations, XAI. But also rockets are obviously something that is expensive. So the company needs the cash. It feels like now is a good moment. They've stabilized the operation in terms of the space operation. Starlink is doing extremely well. They keep signing up customers, particularly in the aviation space. So that it feels like now is the kind of moment. And if you look at the flip side, they always have a monopoly. If you look at what's going on with other rocket launches, we only a couple of saw the explosion on the New Glenn. That's the that's sort of the rival product. So that really sort of cemented in a slightly tragic way, even though nobody was hurt or killed even, but it cemented Starlink's and SpaceX's dominance in this sphere. They are really the only game in town, and I think as long as they have that momentum, they want to go ahead and use it. But as you said, I think the conglomerate factor is important. A lot of people, maybe even a year ago or 6 months ago, would have thought they're buying into a fairly clean asset. It's a rocket launcher with a satellite asset attached to it. And now, with the XAI merger, as it were, it's become a lot more messy. And some people might be wondering, what is it that I'm actually buying into here? What is the story? What is the investment story behind this? If you look at the listing and some of the details there, the capex is again a huge number, north of 20 billion, and more than half of that is going to flow into the artificial intelligence operation. So, it's interesting that what was once a fairly clean and a fairly stable business has now become a lot messier, and that might also be part of the reason why people might be cooling on it a little bit, and you see this slightly lower price.
I also want to ask you, it's not just about space, of course, it's about defense too. And Bloomberg has some reporting that hit on Friday late in the day that SpaceX has won a $4.16 billion award to develop a golden dome. This is something the president has been hot on for a while to help protect the U.S. from attacks through a layered defense system. This is going to be, we think, working with NORAD, the system that already exists, to kind of have early detection from space. Talk about these ties, not just with NASA, but with the Pentagon as well, and how they impact these companies.
Well, the Pentagon is obviously a huge operation in terms of, dealing out contracts to companies, Palantir, for instance, but also Boeing, and SpaceX obviously wants to be part of this. And Golden Dome, as you mentioned, is sort of, it's the golden version of the Iron Dome, which exists in Israel. But unlike that one, this is sort of a glint in President Trump's eye at this point. So it's something that they want to get out there and want to establish, but it's hugely complicated. Our team has done some pretty good reporting on this, just the complexity of, it's one thing securing a country like Israel, it's another thing securing a huge land mass that is the US. So whoever can contribute to that will seek to have a part of that pie, and SpaceX obviously wants to be part of that. So you're going to see, again, in the next couple of years, everybody trying to pile into that. We know that the Pentagon budget is hugely inflated and will probably keep going up. So there is money to be made here. And, we know that the relationship between President Trump and Elon Musk has been, shall we say, complicated in the last year, but they've come around.
It's been an adventure.
This is, again, a sign that it's been an adventure, and they've gone from like deep bro to, hating each other. Now they sort of swung back a bit. So the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. Right now, they seem to be in good enough shape for an award of a contract here. So they definitely want to be part of this because it is a huge undertaking.
Benny, great to speak with you as always. That's Benedict Campbell, who heads up our aviation and space coverage, joining us from Germany on this Sunday morning. And Christina, it's such a good point here about the role that the Pentagon plays here. And we're seeing a defense secretary who's very keen to re-engineer the way that contracts are meted out. We're seeing that in the AI space in this area as well. I think a fascinating time to kind of look deeply at defense contracting. And this missile defense is particularly interesting. So my dad worked at NORAD, Northcom, growing up when we were in Colorado, and their whole job was to do this exact thing. But U.S. does have a missile defense system, but it is outdated. It could use a revamp. But you now have to integrate this private sector into the public sector and make sure it's working. So that'll be the back end of this, and we'll have to see how well it goes. Did your dad work on the Santa tracker? He did. Amazing. He did. NORAD Santa tracker. We will have to. Yeah, it was really cool. I digress. Really cool. All right, Colombia voting today in a presidential election that could redefine that country's relationship with the U.S. We're going to go live to Bogota after this. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. Colombia is experiencing a spike in violence ahead of today's presidential election. Reports of voters being threatened or pushed to support specific candidates in rural parts of the country ahead of the vote to replace the current left-leaning president, Gustavo Petro. Colombia, one of Latin America's largest economies and a key U.S. partner in the region. It's also home to the world's largest population of Venezuelan refugees. Joining us now to delve into all of this is Bloomberg's Colombia reporter, Andrea Jaramillo. Andrea, thank you for joining us. If you could just kind of give us the big picture, what the safety concerns are, what kind of mood voters are in ahead of the polls, and who the frontrunners are in this race.
So, yes, you were mentioning we're coming off of 4 years of the government of Gustavo Petro, and he's Colombia's first leftist leader. So that's where we are, starting off with that base. And then when we're talking about the new candidates, who we have is the ally of the current president. His name is Iván Cepeda. And then we have the main candidates are two conservative candidates. One of them is a senator. Her name is Paloma Valencia. And the other is a lawyer. His name is Abelardo de la Espriella.
There are limits, of course, of what we can say here on voting day. Can't talk about polling and the like, but maybe you could just talk about the role that the violence that Christina alluded to at the top is playing in sort of getting voters to the polls today. This is a country that had enjoyed a kind of period of calm after the FARC wielding a lot of power in the country that had subsided, and now it seems like violence is once again a day-to-day issue for many Colombians. How much is that a motivating factor, getting people to the polls today for this presidential election?
So we do have a spike in violence. We had Colombia came from reaching a peace agreement with the FARC, and in 2016, and now 10 years later, part of the security and what has been seen as a spike in violence is that drug trafficking groups have been increasing their power in the country. And part of that is seen because of the current president, Gustavo Petro, his policy on wanting to sign peace agreements with several groups at the same time. So there has been ceasefire agreements between Petro, where the government has told the army, stop attacking. And so that has helped illegal groups, drug trafficking groups, take part in greater part of the country. And so Petro's ally, which is the senator, the leftist senator, Cepeda, who has been leading in polls, he's one of the central figures in this, what the government has been doing. It's called total peace. So that's on the one side. And as we were saying, security has become a major concern. It is the main concern among voters right now. And that leads us to the two conservative candidates. Paloma Valencia, she is conservative. She comes from the traditional right with conservative parties. And then we have Abelardo de la Espriella. I know his name is a mouthful, maybe.
Listen, you said it fabulously. As long as I don't have to read it, I have full faith.
I guess Abelardo, he refers to himself as the tiger. So a lot of people here do call him the tiger, and he is seen as hardliner on security, and that really has been his message. So as we've seen, as we get closer, and today obviously is the vote. Surveys, the polls have shown that Paloma Valencia, who would become Colombia's first woman president, she has been pushed, squeezed aside by this outsider who is Abelardo, again, de la Espriella, but let's call him Abelardo. And Abelardo, or the tiger, he's a lawyer. He's defended notorious crime bosses in Colombia, but again, his straightforward message of being a security hardliner is really what seems to be pushing him to this vote. So where we are right now is today we have the first round votes. Polls have showed that we will probably go to a second round in 3 weeks' time, and that's because it doesn't look like leftist Cepeda or any of the two other main candidates will get 50+1% of the votes.
Andrea, thank you very much. We'll count on your coverage over the course of the day as we kind of look to see if there is that majority victor over the course of the election. Thank you very much for the update there from Bogota. And Christina, I think one thing we didn't talk about here is the role of President Trump, who hasn't weighed in officially on this race, but you look at Latin America broadly right now, and the tack this administration has taken, all under the aegis of this Don Roe doctrine, showing much more interest, I think, in Latin American politics and really embracing leaders who are more in keeping with the way that President Trump comports himself, more center-right, right-leaning ones. So President Petro, as you know well, when he was here for the UN General Assembly, had his visa taken away after he spoke out against President Trump. So again, I think that there will be great interest in this race from the White House, from Washington, D.C., and we'll see, as Andrea was talking about, the role of these right-wing politicians. That perception of coziness or complementarity with President Trump will be a big factor here.
And it depends on the moment as to whether that's a benefit or a detractor when folks go to the polls.
Yes,
all right.
Absolutely.
We are, of course, coming up on our 8 a.m. hour here in New York. The next hour of Bloomberg This Weekend starts right now.
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from New York with David Gura, Christina Ruffini, and Lisa Mateo. The latest headlines, key analysis, big interviews, and the stories that hit home on your days off.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. It is 8 a.m. in New York from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm Christina Ruffini.
I'm David Gura alongside Lisa Mateo. We are bringing you the latest breaking news, reporting, and analysis live this morning and every Saturday and Sunday from 7 o'clock to 10 o'clock Eastern Time. Christina, so much to focus on this morning. We were talking about this election in
I feel
Latin
like we
America
really just went around
today.
the world in our first hour.
Oh my gosh, we did that. Ukraine. Of course, we talked about the Middle East and then the Shangri-La dialogue wrapping up as well, giving us kind of perspective on the U.S. tack toward the Indo-Pacific as well.
We talked about Lebanon and those Israeli incursions and why that could be significant in the Iran negotiations with the U.S. And also we went to Democratic Republic of Congo.
Yes.
Talked to our colleague who has been inside some of those hospitals there and about the needs, not just medicine, but also basic supplies like food and water so that those patients can be strong enough to fight this disease.
Incredibly valuable to get his perspective. You mentioned what's happening in Lebanon. I know Lisa Mateo is going to give us an update on what's happening there and other stories around the world. Lisa?
You got it. Yeah, Israel has expanded its ground assault in Lebanon. It's Israel's broadest incursion into the country for a quarter of a century as Hezbollah stepped up its attacks on Israel's north. Now, according to the Israeli military, Hezbollah fired more than 300 projectiles at its soldiers in Lebanon and at northern Israel over the weekend. The escalation, well, it comes as the U.S. hosted a ceasefire talk between Israel and Lebanon. The U.S. has affirmed that deals with Iran to safely sail through the Strait of Hormuz, even those which don't involve paying a toll, are not allowed. That's according to an updated statement from the U.S. Treasury. The White House has sent conflicting messages on the prospects. In an interview on Fox, President Trump said he's in no hurry for a deal, and if the U.S. doesn't get what it's asking for, we will end it in a different way. Well, back here at home, protests continue outside of Delaney Hall Immigration Detention Center in Newark, New Jersey. State police, they've set up designated protest zones and vehicle checkpoints in the area. Clashes between demonstrators and federal immigration enforcement agents, they have intensified. Governor Mikey Sherrill says it has grown unsafe, adding that people from outside the state have been escalating the situation. This woman explained why she showed up.
It's important for me to be out here today to support all of the detainees and the family members who are on a hunger strike. I believe it's 9 days now, who are in cruel and conditions.
Newark Mayor Ross Baraka, he ordered a mandatory curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. for about a half a mile surrounding Delaney Hall. In other news, authorities say they have recovered and identified the last victims from the Nippon Dynawave packaging company chemical tank earlier this week. Longview Fire Department Chief Brad Hadding.
Today, on day 5 of this incident, I can share that we have recovered the 9th and final missing employee of this incident. As incident commander and as your fire chief, as a member of this community, I hope today will give the families so affected by this incident the closure needed to begin the long process of healing.
And that tank had contained more than 500,000 gallons of a mixture used to break down wood for making paper. It's one of the deadliest workplace accidents in recent decades. David and Christina, the cause of the tank, though, that's still under investigation.
So a startling story, and I think comes on the heels of that other one that we were watching out of Southern California as well, where there was concern about a chemical tank there.
This is
makes one wonder about how widespread this is.
100%, and what kind of oversight is going on right now. Thanks, Lisa.
Well, President Trump is asking for several amendments to the Iran peace deal his envoys have been negotiating with Iran. That is according to Axios, which reports the president particularly wants to strengthen points around Iran's nuclear material and capabilities. So we had to say about those capabilities on Fox News last night.
Shouldn't have been in Iran, but Iran has the capability. If we didn't hit them with the B-2 bombers 9 months ago, they would have a nuclear weapon right now. And it would be a whole different story. Probably would have used it. You probably wouldn't have had you wouldn't have had Israel, but you probably wouldn't have had a Middle East. And then where do they go from there? And you get to see that when you see that when we went back, they had missiles aimed at Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain. They all got hit. And we were surprised. I was surprised. Actually, I viewed it as a positive because all those people came immediately to our side. They got hit. Now, they could have taken another view. They could have said, well, we want no part of it. Not that they like it, but they came to our side. And Iran is in a very bad position.
Our colleagues at Bloomberg Economics have done something very valuable. They've put together a breakdown comparing the original JCPOA to the president's initial demands to what is in this proposed memo of understanding. Christina, what is the reporting surrounding the nuclear capabilities? Start us off with that.
That's right. All right, we've put this up big on the board for our TV audience, but for our audio audience, don't worry, I'm going to take you through it. Okay, so during the JCPOA, what was agreed to is Iran said it wouldn't pursue a nuclear weapon. It would retain low-level enriched uranium. That's for those civilian purposes, and it submit to IAEA monitoring. Now, there was debate about whether or not they were cheating on that, but I've talked to folks at IAEA that said any visibility was valuable in order to keep tabs on what Iran was actually doing. This time around, the U.S. initially said it wanted a complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Now, where we are with this MOU, as reported so far, is Iran will agree not to pursue a nuclear weapon, enriching limits, and monitoring, and TBD. Not a lot of specifics there. And of course, we're still working through the deal, and we've heard different things from the White House and from Iran. We've also got, when it comes to existing uranium, in 2015, and the JCPOA said it would excess low-enriched uranium would be shipped out of Iran, or it would be blended down, and about 25,000 pounds of that did, in fact, leave the country. The initial U.S. demand at the start of this conflict was that all that uranium would be transferred or destroyed. Remember, the president said it's all got to go. They've got to hand it over. We've got to get rid of it. The current MOU, as reported, is Iran will agree to negotiate over what to do with that uranium. That's it. That's where we're at.
All right, so we've got the nuclear issue there. How about the issue of sanctions? There's been a lot of talk here about what's going to happen with that going forward, again, if the president gets his way here and the deal's kind of shaped in the image that he wants.
Yeah, so this has been really interesting, too, because in the JCPOA, remember the snapback sanctions? Remember we were talking about snapback sanctions? I feel like if I heard that phrase one more time. So you had these nuclear sanctions. They was sanctions relief. It unlocked oil banking and trade. 1.7 billion was the settlement number. The initial U.S. demands here were that Iran would get sanctions relief only after concessions and no repeat of this cash to Iran that the president talked about on the trail especially. Now, the MOU, as we understand it, is the U.S. commits to discuss sanctions relief and discuss the release of frozen assets, but nothing concrete so far.
Appreciate you walking us through that. Chris Kennedy put that breakdown together. He's Bloomberg Economics' lead on economic statecraft. He's also served in the National Security Council under both Presidents Biden and President Trump as its international economics director. Chris, what are the most glaring differences between the JCPOA and the proposed memo of understanding? I think we talk a lot here about, where we're going back to is sort of where we were. How much is that true as you've kind of gone and compared these two documents? Yes, the one that was ratified and the one that the president wants to have put in place.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me, David, and good morning. I think it seems to me that the maximum that the U.S. can expect at this point is to get back to something resembling the JCPOA. But even that's going to take significant time. And the biggest impediment is that now Tehran has leverage that it never had back in 2015. It's showed that it can control traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, choke off energy supplies to the world. And that's giving it significant leverage that it never had previously.
Jeff Mason is back with us at the table. Jeff, I want to ask you, when you look at what has been established in the past with JCPOA, obviously we both covered the first administration. I covered Secretary Pompeo, who railed against this deal, said the U.S. had to pull out of it. Worst deal ever, was something we heard over and over again. The very extreme demands at the start of this conflict and where we are, even if what ends up getting settled is somewhere in between where the president started and the JCPOA, is that something that is going to cost him politically? It seems weird to talk about politics at a time of war, but of course it always matters, and he's got to sell this before November. Will voters care, or are they just going to go with him because they just need plausible deniability? If the president says it's a good deal, you think his voters will sign on to that?
Sure. Well, first of all, I don't think it's weird to talk about it at all, but I'm a political reporter.
Strange. I know. I always feel strange about it.
But I think it's actually really relevant because the president went into this war with a sales pitch of sorts, and that sales pitch has changed repeatedly over the last several months. And one of the political conflicts he's facing right now is there are people on the right, hawks like John Bolton, who want him to go in and finish the job and not step away. It's like
coming up later in the show, John Bolton.
Ding, ding, ding. I like that. Yeah.
Did that on purpose. But they see this as a big, kind of a once-in-a-generation opportunity to really do something major. And if the president pulls away without doing that, they're going to be disappointed. On the other hand, you've got a bunch of Republicans who are really concerned about holding on to their seats in Congress. So you've got the fuel price problem that we've been talking about for weeks now. That is also a political issue for him. So largely, I guess I would just wrap that up by saying the politics are playing a huge role in this, not only for him, but for both sides of his party.
Chris, let me go back to you here on this issue of economic statecraft, because I think we've talked a lot about the prospects of a 60-day extension and what that would mean. We've also talked about how Iran closing off the strait in which it has kind of proves that they have a weapon at their disposal that perhaps they could use again, despite the president's adamance that that not happen. And I'm curious how you think about that. Were there to be an agreement where the ceasefire is extended by 60 days, how much optimism do you have? What's the likelihood here that Iran wouldn't deploy or want to lean on that weapon once again, knowing the effect that it's had, not just on the U.S., but on the global economy as a whole?
Well, I think the fact that the missile program, Iran's missile program and their drone program is out of scope of this agreement, it means that obviously Iran will retain that ability to close the strait. Now, will they do it? I mean, I think to the extent that I believe that it's going to be really challenging to get a deal in 2 months, and President Trump may get frustrated with the progress and the deal might break down. There are a lot of points of failure here. There are a lot of things that can go wrong. The president has a tendency to want to claim victory at every moment during this conflict, but also in all prior geopolitical conflicts over things like trade. And Iran does not seem to be as willing to let that slide. They seem to be very untrusting of the negotiation channels that have been set up between Washington and Tehran. So they're taking seriously what Trump says publicly. So it seems to me that given all of the things that purportedly are going to have to be dealt with over the 60 days, especially the really politically sensitive items like the release of funds, which the president has hammered both Obama and Biden for, because there were separate settlements during both administrations. It seems like there is a high likelihood that this will be a recurring issue. And even if we get some of these oil-laden vessels out of the Persian Gulf in the first few weeks of a ceasefire, there's a real risk that those empty vessels will not want to return to the Persian Gulf out of fear of being trapped once again.
100%. That's a completely different risk profile, whether you're willing to take the run and try to get your cargo and your people out, and whether you're willing to expose them once again to what is an unstable and maybe not so durable agreement, especially in the next 30, 60 days. Speaking of other outliers and things that could make this even more difficult than it already is, Jeff, I want to ask you about Israel and Lebanon. Our colleague overseas rightly pointed out that this incursion into Lebanon today by the Israeli forces is huge and the biggest in several decades. Where does Netanyahu stand in all this? Obviously, the Israeli prime minister would like Trump to finish the job. It seems now decreasingly like that's going to happen. Where does this leave him, and where does this leave that relationship?
I think it's a fascinating dynamic. I mean, the two countries went into this war together, but Israel has been the junior partner, and that is just a reality. And the prime minister has also made clear that Israel has probably their best bet as a U.S. president in Donald Trump than they've perhaps ever had. So the relationship is strong, but Netanyahu also has his own agenda and his own things that he cares about, and that's manifesting in this incursion, and it's been manifesting in sort of war planning writ large. I would also like to go back to the JCPOA connection or comparison that we were talking about earlier. The president,
we love the JCPOA here on this weekend show. So.
I mean, don't you just love acronyms? Everyone loves acronyms
So
if you
DC.
cover foreign policy. It is very DC. The president hated that agreement. We all know that. The president hates the idea of giving money to Iran. He was super critical of Obama for that.
Pallets of cash.
What they have exactly. But what he has not answered when he says repeatedly that Iran has already now agreed to not having a nuclear weapon is how they're going to enforce that and how they're going to monitor that. And that was a big part of the JCPOA.
Right.
They had that monitoring. So if there's not, and there may be a piece that they just haven't told us about, but if there's not that piece already, they have the risk politically again of having a deal that is either similar to the JCPOA or not as good, and having to explain why and what led to this.
And that monitoring, There was a lot of criticism, and correct criticism, that Iran was cheating, Iran was hiding facilities. But I remember speaking to Laura Holgate, who was the U.S. ambassador to the IAEA, and she was saying, yes, we know that not all these countries are playing fair, but you can see what they're doing by what's not in a facility, by what's on people's shoes, what kind of equipment is working, where power cords are going. She's like, not having any of that access really puts them on the back foot when it comes to whether Iran is trying to pursue a weapon.
And they had access. They had an ability to get in.
Yeah.
Chris Kennedy, let me stick with Israel here. As Jeff points out, playing the role here of a junior partner, there was that call between Gulf nations and the president, and then he called Benjamin Netanyahu on the heels of that. Jeff saying that they have their own agenda, and I'm very curious how you see their role in the codification of this draft memo of understanding. It strikes me that if they have their own agenda, that could very well involve pursuing military action after the U.S. agrees to stop doing that, should the U.S. agree to stop doing that. How do you think about that variable as you think through the way that this could be codified by the president and by Iran?
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple factors. We've seen, of course, Israel ramp up its incursions into Lebanon, potentially in anticipation of being forced to back off if an MOU does come together. But it's hard to imagine that Israel would be satisfied with an agreement that doesn't have the level of stringent monitoring that we had in the JCPOA, at least, because, of course, Israel was very critical of the JCPOA in its original form. And I think Secretary Rubio said, admitted to the fact that it would be really challenging to get, a really tough monitoring system in place. That can't be done just between the U.S. and Iran. That's going to require third-party neutral monitors, like we had in the case of the JCPOA. And of course, any relief that the U.S. wants, is going to provide to Iran as part of this deal, as part of their agreement to submit to additional monitoring, will require the UN, because the UN will have to roll back its sanctions again. That means you're going to have to get other parties in Europe and elsewhere to agree to whatever deal is worked out. So we're talking, the JCPOA took 20 months to negotiate. We're talking a long time to get to that point. And Israel, of course, is going to be watching very closely, because they know that if Iran is able to get a nuclear weapon, that's going to really change the dynamics in the Middle East forever.
Jeff, very quickly, we have about 30 seconds. Who is leading this effort on the U.S. side? It seems like Vance is now a bit on the outs, according to some reporting. Is it still just this small group of Witkoff and company? Who is really advising the president on this?
I think so. I think it's Witkoff and Kushner. Vance will sort of come in once in a while, but it's still that.
Rubio is factoring in where?
Rubio is factoring in to possibly running for president in a couple of years, or less than that.
Yeah.
So, but overall, it's the same team. And last very quick point is legacy is a big part of this too, and that is its legacy for President Trump and for those people who are involved.
Okay. Jeff Mason, great to see you, as always, here with us here in New York, our White House correspondent. And our thanks to Chris Kennedy joining us for the first time. Hope you come back soon.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris.
Chris Kennedy of Bloomberg Intelligence. Thanks.
All right, and the next hour, we will talk to President Trump's former National Security Advisor, John Bolton, about everything we just broke down. That's ahead on Bloomberg this weekend. Stream us, listen to us, watch us, and on the Bloomberg Business app. We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's get you up to date on today's top stories. President Donald Trump says he would like to get a deal done with Iran, but he's in no hurry.
I'm in no hurry. I'd like to say I'm in a hurry because, gasoline prices are going to come tumbling down. But if you're going to be in a hurry, you're not going to make a good deal. And slowly but surely, we're getting, I think, what we want. And if we don't get what we want, we're going to end it a different way.
President speaking on Fox News. To the Ebola outbreak, where the head of the World Health Organization expressed some optimism while visiting Eastern Congo.
Ebola, caused by the Bundibugyo virus, can be survived with good medical care, and some people here in Italy have already recovered. Seeking care early makes a real difference.
The health organization said Friday the latest official figures showed more than 900 suspected cases and over 200 suspected deaths. And the U.S. military said it carried out another strike of a boat accused of smuggling drugs into the eastern Pacific Ocean. 3 men were killed. It's the third attack this week, pushing the overall death toll to above 200 people. U.S. Southern Command said the vessel was, quote, engaged in narco-trafficking operations and was operated by a designated terrorist organization without providing any evidence. David and Christina, over to you.
Lisa, thanks very much. I go back to what Susie Wiles told Vanity Fair about that a little while back. She said that was going to stop when Nicolas Maduro was no longer president of Venezuela, and yet it continues. So I'm fascinated by that it does and why that is.
And what the goal is.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. All right, well, there are goals in the tech sector, and as more companies incorporate AI into their day-to-day work, some of them are coming to realize that those goals, if using AI to pursue them, come at a bit of a price. Microsoft canceled most of its Claude Code licenses, and Uber's COO said AI costs, are getting, quote, harder to justify.
As Gautam Mukunda writes, innovation doesn't only need the technology, but also the physical infrastructure to support the product. Gautam is a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion and a lecturer at the Yale School of Management. He joins us now on set here in New York. Wonderful to see you. Let's talk about this, the effervescence, the enthusiasm surrounding AI, meeting the reality of having to pay for it. And there are extreme things that I think of, the amount of money, for instance, that Meta has poured into this. And it's begun to retrench some of that here. How widely spread is that? Are a lot of companies kind of reckoning with what is this going to be, and is it worth the investment at this point in time?
So, great to be here. Yes, but there's a nuance here, right? So, there's a company I was talking to the CEO yesterday. He said, if Claude charged us 10 times what it does right now, he said, I would pay it, and I wouldn't hesitate. He's like, I wouldn't even think twice.
But what kind of company is that, and what is the application?
Right, it's a small healthcare company. So, there's a big difference when you have 10,000 engineers who are running $2,000 per head. If you go 10x, right, things change when you're at that scale. But I think what's driving this is it's really interesting that the debate on AI is kind of missing something pretty big, right? When that I think is what this cost thing is starting to drive us towards. Because you see, there are the boosters, and I used to code. The ability to talk to my computer and have it do something is genuinely, it feels miraculous.
Fantastic.
It's astonishing. Yeah. And then there are people, some of them people with enormous scientific and technical credibility who say, this is not going to come together the way you think. Like, this technology doesn't have the potential you think. There's hype. Those are also serious people. You shouldn't dismiss them.
Not doomers per se, but skeptics of this, yeah.
There's a third scenario, which it just strikes me no one talks about, which is you can have a revolutionary, world-changing, astonishing technology that doesn't end up making anyone any money. And this is the thing that I don't see people talking about. And I'll give you 2 examples. The airline, no one would deny that the airline industry, right, just changed the world, right? You can go anywhere in perfect safety and eat peanuts on the way. Just remarkable.
More of a pretzels gal myself, but I'm going with you. Continue.
But, Warren Buffett famously said that the airlines were such a machine for incinerating capital that if an enterprising capitalist had been at Kitty Hawk when Orville took his flight, he should have shot the thing down, right? No, you can change the world and not make money. In biotech, you saw sort of, the biotech revolution starting in 1975. So from 1975 to 2004, Gary Pisano at Harvard Business School showed that the biotech industry might maybe have made money in 1 year, right? And for that entire time, it was essentially just a furnace for money. You poured money in and, drugs came out, lives came saved, but people didn't make money, right? And you've got huge capital investments, lots of uncertainty, long delays before payoff, enormous costs. Oh, and the problem that AI is dealing with that biotech didn't is the open weights labs out of China in the last benchmarks are 4 to 8 months behind.
Wow.
That's not much of a moat.
That's right.
Yeah.
I also want to ask you talk a lot about the physical end of this and the scarcity of compute and these data centers that have to go in. And you make a comparison to Edison when they were starting. Please explain that.
Right. So when Edison built the light bulb, this is so iconic that when we have a bright idea, a cartoonist sketches a light bulb over our head.
David gets more of those than I do, but it's fine.
So fantastic. My wife says that mine are very dim, but that's fine.
You know what? It's there, and that's what matters.
That's the key. But he did when the first Edison generator plant rolled out in New York City, and they were serving something like 400 light bulbs. Wow. Right? So you can have an astonishing technology, but you need a network, an ecosystem of other enabling technologies that have to build up to do that. In his case, it was generators and wiring and everything involved in a power transmission system. For AI, so we are used to, and I think a lot of the sort of, especially the VCs who went into AI is so heavy, they're kind of used to investing in SaaS companies, right? Where scaling costs zero and the marginal cost of production is zero. But AI is profoundly quite different, right? Because you don't see, as users go up, the marginal cost going down that much.
It stays the same.
I won't say it stays the same, but it doesn't drop.
Pretty flat.
It doesn't drop
Okay.
to zero, right?
Yeah.
Like, just these things are really expensive to run. And so the scaling of this involves capital expenditures and physical construction and, simple stuff. Pouring concrete, wiring buildings. Those things are hard, right? They're not like dumping code onto the internet.
Yeah.
And you need plumbers and electricians. And, my joke about it was it's the return of the jocks, right? It's the guys who actually, and the women, of course, who do physical labor are becoming constraint here. That is unlike most things that the software, that this world has seen before.
And a lot of those trades are understaffed as well at the moment. Yeah.
Let me look at the other side of that coin, though, and I think you're talking about how this might not make money, might not lead to the kind of changes a lot of proponents are talking about here. It does strike me, the fact that this does have this whole complementary infrastructure component to it may make us less willing to see the fact that it might not make money, that this is seen as not just something that's going to improve the economy of information technology, financial services, but could have this wider spread effect on the U.S. economy. Do you think that's true? Is it clouding our sense? Are we willing to pony up and pay for all of this physical construction because it seems like it's providing these wider benefits to the country?
So I think that cuts both ways. Right, so it is, if you are an electrician right now, this is awesome. Like this is fantastic. This is the best thing that's happened to you in a long time. And since the United States has sort of apparently decided as a matter of national policy, we're not going to build housing, and at least we're building.
But we'll build data centers.
At least we'll build something. That's great. But of course, the flip side of that is data centers are incredibly unpopular. They cause political pushback everywhere they go. Large portions of Silicon Valley appear to have adopted the PR strategy of James Bond villains. And there is this kind of, I think, in some cases, I'm not sure this is about the data center as much as just an incoherent rage of pushback. And this is a thing we can go after, right? And so when you're building this kind of infrastructure, you need the people there to say yes. And right now, America, despite all these benefits, and I mean, Loudoun County, Virginia,
oh my gosh,
just said that they're
can't throw a stone without hitting a data center.
I grew up in Rockville, Maryland, so this is like home for me, right?
Yeah.
60% of their tax revenues are going to be coming from data centers. Wow. So you would think this would be great, and yet instead you're seeing this huge pushback. I think this is another case where the industry's norms that have evolved over the last generation kind of need to yield to the fact that having a public relations campaign where we're going to take away your job and possibly end humanity.
Not a great pitch, Gautam. Yeah.
But there's another PR element that you highlight in your latest column, and I wasn't even that aware of this, and that's you talk about where they're choosing to put some of this infrastructure, and it's in places that feels a bit exploitive. Like especially there's this Colossus 1 is going in largely without air permits in a largely black neighborhood of Memphis. You talk us through why those places and what that's doing.
I mean, those places have less political power to push back when the pollution gets so bad, right? And so if you are under enormous pressure to scale up your compute and you decide that the way to do that is to cut corners, and given all the obstacles that we've just talked about, you can see why the way you might decide to do that is to cut corners. It's easiest to do it in places where people have the least power to complain. If you do that in, Malibu, it's not going to go down.
A vociferous NIMBY crew in Malibu.
We've all spent a lot of time in D.C. Even in Loudoun County, if Loudoun County didn't want those data centers, you can bet they wouldn't be going in there.
That's right.
I want to ask how you're thinking about the effect this is having on the labor market. So you mentioned that pitch, this is going to take away all the jobs. Opened up my computer on Friday. Torsten Slok of Apollo had this note. There is no negative effect on the labor market because of AI. We're not seeing jobs lost as a result of it yet. How are you thinking about that? Putting aside, again, all of the kind of ideological perspectives on where this might lead to eventually, do you think it is having an effect? Is it changing how companies, the CEOs of whom you talk regularly, the way that they hire, the way that they fire, the way that they staff their companies yet?
Yeah, but what I'd say is what it's showing up in is it's two ways, right? It's less firing, although we're seeing some of that, and a lot of the firing that is happening is less, I think, about AI enabling productivity and more people kind of scrambling for cash to sort of try and chip away at these gigantic capital expenditures. Yeah. But it's making it less, I think people are becoming more reluctant to hire just because of the uncertainty. But I think the deeper and more profound effect is about fear. right? You saw, especially during COVID, you saw the balance of power between companies and developers and people who had these skill sets swung really hard in favor of labor. What this does is it creates fear. Even if I'm not being replaced, I might be replaced, which makes me a lot more reluctant to ask for a raise or say I should have a say in the way the companies are governed. And I think a lot of CEOs, especially founder CEOs, for whom their company is their identity, are like, I'm not sure I want to give these people a say in how this.
We've only got about a minute left, and I'm going to ask the question that I always ask. I'm a bit of a skeptic about all this. One of the reasons is you talk about all this building, all this infrastructure, and a lot of that is being funded by credit, and a lot of credit, and a lot of circular credit. And for millennials who've lived through multiple crashes, I just feel like this is deja vu all over again. What is your take? Is this a bubble? Is this sustainable? Is it durable? Is it rippling, if not popping? Where are we?
You can have a bubble and still have a real technology. And that, I think, that's sort of to go back to where we were. That's the point that people are missing, right? You can say these valuations are insane. You can look at, SpaceX, which is apparently now an AI company, and say, you're $1.75 trillion for these financials, and say, if that's not a bubble, I don't know what is. I don't know what the GDP of Mars is going to be.
Well, no, we've been talking about, there's a meme going around that NVIDIA is worth more than all the arable land in Australia. Yeah. Right. At some point, that just seems ridiculous.
Yeah, and so, but at the same time, you can say that 20, 30 years from now, this was a bubble, but something came out of it that was really powerful. That won't be a lot of consolation if you lose your shirt in the meantime.
We will leave it there on that note. Gautam Mukunda, thank you very much. Great to see you. Lecturer at the Yale School of Management, of course, columnist for Bloomberg Opinion as well. And I think of what Benedict Campbell told us a few moments ago, just about the way that SpaceX has become this kind of sprawling conglomerate. I guess we can look forward to data centers in space and the like, but we'll see if investors buy into that kind of amorphous sense of what that company is.
Not to mention, that prospectus from Elon Musk, where he was talking about all kinds of things beyond technology. Yes. Men on Mars, colonies.
6 million men on Mars.
It's, it's aspirational. I'll give him that.
It is,
all right.
Indeed. All right, up next here, the director of the Emmy Award-winning documentary Can't Look Away is here to talk about a possible decision in New Mexico on social media and kids' safety. That is coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. And celebrations turned into violence after Paris Saint-Germain's second Champions League title win. Now, here's what happened. Fans began celebrating in Paris Saturday after the final whistle earlier in the evening in Budapest, Hungary, where the team won by beating Arsenal on penalties. They then set off flares, blared car horns, and a group even tried to storm a police station in the French capital. Police tried to contain the crowd and detained about 45 people. One police officer was injured. Another big upset at the French Open. Coco Gauff's reign at the Roland Garros ended in a shocking third-round loss to 28th seed Anastasia Potapova. Now, Gauff said she felt she had failed to perform under pressure in the decisive moments. The PGA tournament at Colonial Country Club enters its final day. Topping the leaderboard is Eric Cole at 12 under par, followed by Ryan Gerard at 11 under par, and a tie between third, Mac Meissner, and also J.J. Spahn. And the NBA Finals are set. The Knicks will be playing the San Antonio Spurs. San Antonio beat the Oklahoma City Thunder last night in Game 7, 111-103. Game 1 of the NBA Finals. It begins Wednesday night, and it's actually going to be a rematch of the last time the Knicks made the finals when they lost to the Spurs in 1999. David, Christina, that's not going to happen again this time.
No, I'm with you on that. I may have stayed up till the end of that game last night, which may account for some of my punchiness.
You did? Ah, I'm impressed.
Difficulty finding words this morning, but it was a great game. Wemby's looking good, but I think this is good for the Knicks.
Yes,
that's
it's
my
really
analysis.
Good. I was hoping the Spurs would win, but
all
there
right,
we go.
We shall see. Lisa, thank you very much.
Nothing
you
to
don't care?
contribute. Nothing to
contribute.
Get on board.
But it's not too late to be a fair weather fan.
I'm happy that you're happy. Yeah, I like a jersey. Sure. All right.
Good.
Colors are cute.
We'll
I'm
get
into
you
it.
One.
Okay.
All right. Right now, a state judge in New Mexico is weighing whether to label Meta's social media apps a public nuisance, a decision that could have a profound impact on the tech giant that ripples across America and around the world.
This comes after a jury found that the company violated state consumer protection and child safety laws back in March and slapped them with a $375 million fine in financial penalties.
But in this juryless phase, the judge is considering a series of requirements, including implementing an independent safety monitor, pausing app notifications for kids during school hours, adopting stronger policies on harmful content involving children, and more visible health and safety warnings.
A Meta spokesperson calls this, quote, overreach and misguided. The Bloomberg documentary, Can't Look Away, dug into the battles that hold tech companies accountable.
How many more children have to die because Snapchat chooses profits over safety?
I was stopped 7 times.
I don't know of any other kids that OD'd on fentanyl that are still here.
The Social Media Victims Law Center. It is a law firm founded for the sole purpose of holding social media companies accountable for the harms that they're causing children.
Let's say I'm a dealer. I can easily locate you. Hey, I'm going to be at the park around the corner. You can come meet me here. It's like the platform was built for that.
I found my son's lifeless body due to fentanyl poisoning. They have the best distribution system in the world, and nobody has stopped them.
What do you say to those parents, Mr. Speaker?
I'm so sorry that we have not been able to prevent these tragedies.
Matthew O'Neill co-directed that film based on reporting by Bloomberg's Olivia Carville. I should say it picked up some hardware this week. I'm going to get the name of it right. An Emmy for Outstanding Business and Economic Documentary. Congratulations to both of you. You both join us. Now, Olivia, let me start with you. And it's been a while since you and I have last spoken. And since then, we have seen so much movement in the courts on this side of things. How has that changed the story as you see it? So much of your very good reporting here has animated the conversation surrounding all of this. To what extent do you think here that these court decisions are making a noticeable difference here in the way that we look at our social media apps and the power that we have over these companies?
Well, I think the first thing is it's really changing the entire conversation around social media. When I first started looking into this subject, people were asking the question of whether social media could potentially impact kids. You know, is this good for children? Is it bad for children? Let's ask the question. Now, through this litigation, this is really being deemed a full-blown public health crisis. And people all over the world are taking notice of what we're seeing in the American justice system. And also countries are actually starting to ban social media for kids, which is something we hadn't seen until, recent years. So I feel like the litigation, while it's been brewing for nearly half a decade now, has already made a profound impact. And those 2 verdicts that came down in March are only going to continue to change the way in which social media impacts our children and how we use these products and how we actually interact with the internet, in its entirety.
Olivia, you mentioned countries trying to ban social media. The one that comes to mind is this effort in Australia. I will confess I haven't followed up on it recently. I'm wondering, do you know how that is doing, what the pushback has been, and if it's working? Is it too soon to know?
It's kind of getting mixed results right now. It depends who you talk to. Some say the ban isn't working at all because children are savvy. They understand how to use these products and they know that there are workarounds and they can get on the apps in different ways, even if the platforms do try to ban them. And other people say, well, regardless of whether some kids can get around it, the fact that the majority are not on social media is good enough, and it's a good place to start. So we have seen kind of controversial results coming out of Australia, and I think a lot of people are following what's happening there. But we've seen other countries as well start to move in this direction. Denmark, Spain, France, countries all over the world are considering doing what Australia has done, because now there is a real belief that social media is not a place that children need to be involved in, that they don't need access to these apps from the age of 8, 9 or 10 years old, which is what we've seen through some of this litigation, and that really their brains aren't fully developed enough to understand the way in which the platforms are manipulating them and to push back against the addictive features that the platforms have designed to try and keep them glued to the screen for as long as possible. So what started in Australia has kind of had a rolling wave right across the world. And we're also seeing some states consider these same, potential bans for children as well here in the US.
Matt, let me ask you about that, sort of what we're seeing at the state level. And I'm curious if you think there is kind of a safe version of all of this that kids could have limited access to. How are you thinking about sort of what is practicable and could make a difference here at the state level?
That's something I think about a lot because I have 2 school-age kids who are, of course, wrestling with phone use and watch use and trying to understand how to engage these things. But I think the real shift that has changed, when Perry Peltz and I first started working with Olivia on this film and with Bloomberg, we had a vague sense that social media was bad, but the culture has shifted. What the films like Can't Look Away, what these court cases do, what the Social Media Victims Law Center has done. Everyone's now talking about social media harms and children. Children are aware of it, parents are aware of it. So whereas 3 years ago, it wasn't something where there was even a thought of holding these big companies to account, now it's something that's happening day to day in the courts, in the media, and I think around the dinner table.
And Matthew, I'll ask you this, but Olivia, if you've got opinions, you can jump in at the end here. Do you think the sea change is because so many adults have also seen the adverse impact that social media is having on them and think this is only going to be exacerbated in a kid who is still developing? I mean, it stresses me out. I notice I'm getting too addicted to it, and I'm nominally an adult. I mean, do you think that's part of it? We're also seeing, I saw this chart this week talking about people are not using social media to be social anymore. They're not talking to each other. They're mostly just looking at information or shopping or getting hit by targeted ads.
Well, that's the biggest thing, is that when you look at Instagram right now, most of what's appearing on Instagram is advertising. It's not like you're connecting with your friends. It's an illusion that people are actually using this to connect, especially for children. The children are being targeted. They're being targeted by big companies trying to sell them things. And I think that's also part of the change. 10, 15 years ago, it was exciting and novel to connect to people, or for people of our generation to reconnect to someone you knew in high school.
And like sad little photos of our meals. It was very benign.
Right.
Yeah.
But now it's all about what money they can make. And the kids don't want that. Kids are smart. The more they learn about it, it's the same thing with cigarettes. Once they realized that Joe Camel was a cartoon character that was made to sell them stuff, they weren't interested. Same thing's happening with social media.
Olivia, we've got about 30 seconds. I wonder what your take is on that. Yeah.
I mean, these are the biggest advertisers in the world. They sell themselves as social media platforms, and they are to a respect, but their business model is based around advertising. And when we think back to the Facebook that we remember, it looks very different to the Facebook or Instagram that we use today. And I think children didn't see that shift, but their parents did. And I think parents understand the products look different, but what they don't understand is how they've impacted, manipulated, and addicted their children who have been hooked to these devices from a very young age. We've got a generational divide here between what kids have experienced and what their parents have experienced. And I think we haven't really got a full understanding of what the consequences of that is going to be.
Olivia, always good to talk to you. Olivia Carville, our colleague here at Bloomberg News. Matt O'Neill, thank you very much for joining us as well, and congrats on the Emmy as well. Great to have you both here.
So nice to see you with that hardware. All right. Speaking of those NBA finals, they are set. Who's facing off against the Knicks and whether you're going to be able to afford tickets. That's coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend. Stick with us.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura with Christina Ruffini, and for the first time in 27 years, the New York Knicks are back in the NBA Finals. They're going to face the San Antonio Spurs, and the championship series kick off on Wednesday night.
Knicks fans have been waiting a long time for this, for New York to bring home an NBA championship, and they're willing to pay a lot for a shot at witnessing that history firsthand.
Indeed they are. We spoke with Vanessa Perdomo, host of Bloomberg's Business of Sports podcast, about why prices at Madison Square Garden are so astronomical.
You're going to see fluctuation no matter what on these ticket prices, but everyone did go to StubHub like right away, and even earlier this week, we saw when pre-sale was happening, Chase did a pre-sale, and it was $2,000 opening prices for a pre-sale ticket, which is something that you don't really see ever, right? The problem with, leagues and people, they try to say it's the secondary ticket prices that go super high. Yeah. But these are actually the main ticket prices that are starting really high. And then once you get to the secondary ticket price, it's astronomical. We're seeing tickets up to $80,000. A reporter, had found out that 2 tickets had sold for the court side for $279,000 on StubHub, and that was a confirmed sale.
What do you make of it as somebody who covers this industry? Is this like a strictly New York phenomenon? What does it say just about who's going to games, who fans are in this year, 2026?
Well, who's going to the games is extremely wealthy individuals. And obviously, if your company loves you that much, you might get some hospitality seats out of the deal. But what we're seeing is tickets prices have increased. It's something we've been talking about a lot when we're covering the World Cup. But this, for the NBA Finals, is a very specific New York thing. Obviously, the Knicks haven't been back in the finals since 1999. So people have been waiting. They're really excited. But last year was actually the most was the cheapest the finals have been in a really long time. The average for last year was about $1,100 per tickets. I mean, it was Indiana and OKC, so there were two of the smaller markets. But even we're seeing this year with the West Coast, all the games outside of MSG, those ticket prices have gone up more than they would have been last year just because the Knicks are in the finals.
You mentioned 1999. I think a lot of us taking a trip down memory lane to those finals back in 1999, the Knicks versus the Spurs. Here we have that matchup once again. When you look at these two teams with one another, do the Knicks have a better shot this time around than they did now 20 plus years ago?
It's really hard to say because of Victor Wembanyama is this freak of nature athlete.
He's so big.
He's so good. And obviously with Mitchell Robinson not being at 100%.
Pinky injury, but he got surgery and he's still playing. So that's obviously a good thing, but it's not going to be the best for his defensive game on Victor Wembanyama. But I do think that they have a better chance. The Knicks are actually favored in this series. What explains the success of the Knicks this year? I mean, this is a team that I love to watch because they seem, at least at face, so close to one another. Brunson, Towns, Hart. I mean, it's a great crew of players. Could you have foreseen this at the beginning of the season? What has gotten them this far?
I don't think you could have foreseen this at the beginning of the season, and I think that even you didn't foresee this in the beginning of the playoffs, actually. And I think what it took the turn was them coming back for the game one of the Eastern Conference Finals. They had the biggest comeback ever in the Eastern Conference Finals. Came back by nearly 20 points with 7 minutes to go in the fourth quarter. I think that really drove the team in this playoff run, and it's made them come to the finals. They have so much confidence going into this. I mean, when you go through a sweep like that and you have so much time off, when you go through two sweeps, I mean, that really gives you a lot of confidence going into the finals, and I think they know how bad New York wants this, and I don't think that that's wasted on the players. I think Jalen Brunson wants to be the person who brings a championship back to New York.
You're excited. I'm excited. All of New York City is excited about this, including the Dolan family, who owns this team. I know that there's been some speculation. They've talked openly about the prospects of maybe spinning off the Knicks, spinning off the Rangers. Talk a bit about the business theory behind that. Why does that make sense for MSG right now?
Well, actually, it makes sense because when you see their value on the market, they're valued at around like $8.8 billion on the market, which their shares have gone up since the Knicks have reached the finals. But the reality is the Knicks themselves are worth about $9.8 billion, and the Rangers are worth about $4 billion on their own. So if you spin them off into their own properties, you're only going to get more money for each, and you're actually going to be able to see what the market values them when the Knicks are doing better on their own. If the Rangers are doing better on their own, you're going to be able to see that value.
These valuations are crazy. Or are they? I mean, like, are all teams now kind of in that stratosphere?
No, I mean, the valuations are crazy.
They are,
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, but you know what? The funny thing is the valuation of the Knicks is actually probably lower than what they would go for. Obviously, if they were still together with Madison Square Garden as an entity, you see the Lakers just were sold earlier this year or last year for $10 billion. The Celtics are $6.1 billion. And the Knicks are technically the highest valued team, right? You would think in the NBA. So their valuation is right on the money, I think. Sports valuations have gone up to an astronomical amount that every single owner really has to explore selling off minority stakes at this point if they want to do anything with their stadiums or really increase value.
Got about a minute left, and I got to ask you about the World Cup happening kind of coincident with this. And as we talk about the craziness of ticket prices for the NBA Finals, I mean, World Cup is another level. But I now gather that law enforcement, government's looking into how high some of these ticket prices are.
They're looking into it. I don't know what they're going to be able to do about it. You know, the reality is FIFA set the dynamic ticket pricing the way they did because they came into the U.S. market. It's not something they've ever done before. They did it, and I've talked to FIFA about this. They said, you know, if we didn't do it, it would have been done to us. So why not, you know, them get the money instead of it happen on the secondary ticket market like we're seeing for the finals and other entities. The New York, again, is really reaping the not so much benefits of that. You know, New Yorkers are actually on the other side of this. If you want to go to a game at MetLife Stadium, it's going to be the same thing. You're going to be paying thousands and thousands of dollars, especially if you want to go to the finals. I do not see a single actual fan being able to go to the World Cup finals.
Vanessa, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Coming up on Bloomberg this weekend, new reporting on how President Trump wants to alter the Iran deal.
I would rather get a deal because we can open the Strait immediately upon signing. The one guarantee that I have to have is that there will be no nuclear weapons.
What the president's former national security advisor, John Bolton, says about the state of play.
Plus, Californians head to the polls this Tuesday. The latest on the race to be the next governor and the campaign to be the mayor of Los Angeles.
The only endorsement I seek and that I have are moms and animal lovers.
As reality TV star Spencer Pratt takes on current mayor Karen Bass and a sitting city councilwoman.
And meeting the Gen Zers who would rather hit the gym than the club.
And they're also looking for a community and places that they can't find at the bar.
What's driving the trend among young people to spend more of their money on a different kind of fun?
Welcome to Bloomberg This Weekend, live from Bloomberg's world headquarters in New York. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. We're here with Lisa Mateo. It is Sunday, May 31st. And David, we've got a lot of news this morning. We've actually been kind of around the world, but we're going to go back where we started here in the 9 a.m. And that's what we're going to focus on. We are waiting to hear any movement on this potential memorandum of understanding, deal, truce, negotiation between the U.S. and Iran. And in lieu of that, we're going to dig into kind of where we were before, where we were at the start of this conflict, and where we are now.
Waiting for that final determination, as the president put it. It seems like he needs more time to come to that conclusion. Axios reporting he needs a few more days to, I guess, massage and edit parts of that memo of understanding in draft form that's been passed back and forth between the Iranians and the U.S. via the Pakistanis. Going to get to all of that in just a few minutes here with Ambassador John Bolton. But before we get there, Lisa Mateo has the headlines this morning. Lisa.
You got it. Protests continue outside of Delaney Hall Immigration Detention Center in Newark, New Jersey. State police, they set up designated protest zones and vehicle checkpoints in the area. Clashes between demonstrators, federal immigration enforcement agents have really intensified. Governor Mikey Sherrill said it has grown unsafe, adding that people from the outside of the state have been escalating the situation. This woman explained why she's speaking out.
It's important for me to be out here today to support all of the detainees and the family members who are on a hunger strike. I believe it's 9 days now, who are in cruel and conditions.
Newark Mayor Ross Baraka ordered a mandatory curfew from 9 p.m. to 6 a.m. for a half a mile surrounding Delaney Hall. In other news, authorities say they have recovered and identified the last of the victims from the Nippon Dynawave packaging company chemical tank failure in Washington earlier this week. Longview Fire Department Chief Brad Hanig.
Today, on day 5 of this incident, I can share that we have recovered the 9th and final missing employee of this incident. As incident commander and as your fire chief, as a member of this community, I hope today will give the families so affected by this incident the closure needed to begin the long process of healing.
The tank contained more than 500,000 gallons of a mixture used to break down wood for making paper. It's one of the deadliest U.S. workplace accidents in recent decades. The cause of the tank's collapse still under investigation. The U.S. has affirmed that deals with Iran to safely sail through the Strait of Hormuz, even though those who don't involve paying a toll are not allowed. Now, that's according to an updated statement from the U.S. Treasury. The White House has sent conflicting messages on the prospects. Now, in an interview on Fox, President Trump said he's in no hurry for a deal, and if the U.S. doesn't get what it's asking for, we will end it a different way. Israel has expanded its ground assault in Lebanon. It's Israel's broadest incursion into the country for a quarter of a century, as Hezbollah stepped up its attacks on Israel's north. According to the Israeli military, Hezbollah fired more than 300 projectiles at its soldiers in Lebanon and northern Israel over the weekend. The escalation comes after the U.S. hosted a ceasefire talks between Israel and Lebanon. David and Christina.
Lisa, thank you very much. And this is really fascinating to me in light of what we've been talking about over the course of the morning and what Chris Kennedy said to us of Bloomberg Economics.
Yeah.
The fact that if there is a fear on Israel's part here that if this memo of understanding is codified, does come to fruition here, Israel's options may be limited in the near the near term. So perhaps that's why we've seen this incursion advance, such as it has here over the last few hours.
Trying to get it in under the radar, as it were, before a potential deal is reached. But, you know, that's still a big if here this morning, even though on Friday we had this pronouncement from the president on social media saying he was going in and would be making this decision. He went into the meeting, came out of the meeting, and there still was not an agreement. So Axios is reporting today that the president, during that meeting, asked for several amendments to the deal negotiated between his envoy and the Iranians.
In particular, he wants to strengthen the sections around Iran's nuclear material, including details on how the U.S. gets that material and when. Here's what he told his daughter-in-law, Laura Trump, on Fox News last night.
This is really a win already. We've defeated their military, essentially defeated their military. I would rather get a deal because we can open the Strait immediately upon signing. The one guarantee that I have to have is that there will be no nuclear weapons. They've agreed to that. And it was very interesting. They originally said, we will not develop a nuclear weapon. I said, well, what happens if you buy a nuclear weapon? So now it says we will not develop or in any way purchase a military weapon. That's a big difference. So we're getting what we want slowly. Very tough negotiators. It takes a long time. I'm in no hurry. I'd like to say I'm in a hurry because, you know, gasoline prices are going to come tumbling down. But if you're going to be in a hurry, you're not going to make a good deal.
We're getting what we want, according to the President of the United States. Joining us now is Ambassador John Bolton. He served as the former U.S. ambassador to the UN and also as National Security Advisor to President Trump during the first term. Mr. Ambassador, great to have you with us once again. Let me start with that line that I repeated there, coming out of that quotation from the President. We are getting what we want. At this juncture, as we live through this weekend after weekend, the President indicating he's close to a deal and then silence or no codified deal at the end of a weekend. Do you feel like the U.S. is getting what it wants out of these negotiations that are taking place between the U.S. and Iran via the Pakistanis?
Well, I think Trump is getting what he wants. This is a deal about gasoline prices at the pump in the United States. Trump worries, obviously, about the price levels people are paying. He's worried about the effect on inflation. He's worried about the effect on the elections in November. But this is not a deal that really ends the war in a satisfactory way for the United States. There's no doubt about it. If the Iranian regime is allowed to survive, which it looks like Trump is prepared to acknowledge, they will simply benefit from the reopening of the Strait to sell more oil, gain more revenue, and entrench themselves in power, giving them time to rebuild their nuclear program, rebuild their military, rebuild their terrorist proxies, and an X period of time will be right back where we started from.
Given that, do you think the U.S. Was in a safer bet with Iran in the JCPOA than they will be after this is worked out?
No, not at all. The 2015 Obama nuclear deal was a failure on many levels. It didn't at all deal with Iran's plutonium route to nuclear weapons in the form of the spent fuel at the nuclear reactor at Bushehr. Just completely left that unattended, and estimates of the amount of spent fuel there that Iran has by nuclear proliferation experts say they could make between 200 and 400 nuclear weapons just from the plutonium route to bombs, not the uranium enrichment route. It's a complicated issue, but the fact is that the JCPOA was illusory, and Iran's strategic determination to get nuclear weapons has never changed.
But all those technical issues that you just pointed out, are you confident that given this negotiating team, we were just talking with our Jeff Mason, our White House correspondent, who was saying the negotiating team is essentially Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff. They don't have a lot of technical experts. Do you have any level of confidence that any of those issues with the previous deal are going to be fixed this time around, given how they are doing this diplomacy?
Well, none whatever. Look, the Iranians are clearly trying to buy time. I mean, they like to sell oil, but this is a contest really of perseverance and determination. They think Trump is closer to buckling than they are. They don't care about the welfare of their people. They care about preserving the regime. And so we're going through this rope-a-dope of these talks about talks. The Economist this week has a great cartoon. It's a bunch of Ayatollahs speaking to two of the Pakistani mediators. And one Pakistani mediator says to the other one, "Tell the Americans they are offering a framework for negotiation of the establishment of a proposal exploring preliminary talks about the tentative prospect of conversations." And the other mediator says, "A great plan of action." That's what we're going through now.
We're going to have you read New Yorker cartoons the next time you're on the show. I think that's I've enjoyed that.
New recurring segment. Yeah, exactly.
Ambassador Bolton, what is your prescription for what needs to happen next? We hear the president continue to threaten that something will happen if they can't come to an agreement. Of course, what's on the table, as we understand it, is more kinetic action, more military action. Are you of the camp, as one might expect, that that's something the U.S. should be pursuing right now? Indeed, what do you see as the path forward here if all that we get out of this is a one-page document with 14 points on it, or an agreement that isn't satisfactory?
Well, I think there are two broad options. One is just to junk the ceasefire, which I think has been a gift from God to the Iranian regime, and go back to full-scale military activity. If Trump's not willing to do that, I think the minimal that he should do, and that we can do, is open the Gulf Arab side of the Strait of Hormuz to get their oil and gas out into international markets. Keep the blockade we've got in effect against Iranian exports, but using military force, I think that will be necessary. Help ensure that exports from the Arab oil-producing countries can get out. We know from reporting in various publications I won't name that this week the U.S. has been helping carriers get out. They've not been attacked. They're turning their transponders off, going at night, kind of sneaking through. That's not a lot of traffic, to be sure, but I think it shows that the Iranian threat here may be more hollow than people think. And to alleviate the pressure on the international economy, I think it's worth using force to open the strait. I think it helps reestablish deterrence to prevent Iran from trying to turn the strait on and off like a light switch in the future.
So that's interesting. So one of the criticisms of how this is going is that there's a sequencing issue. People are saying that the U.S. shouldn't give up its hold on the strait. They should keep the strait kind of locked down, and so they can use that on the nuclear leverage side. You don't see the sequencing issue as a problem here with the way this is being negotiated? You think they should open the strait and then tackle the nuclear issue?
Well, I think we should keep the blockade against Iranian exports. So no, I wouldn't
understand.
open the
Apologies.
strait generally. Yeah, no, but I will say whenever diplomats start talking about sequencing as being the only problem, hold on to your wallet, because it means there's really a bigger problem they're trying to obscure.
I want to ask you about what's happened here as a weapon for Iran in the future. We've talked about this over the course of the morning as well. We're talking about the prospects of extending this kind of squishy ceasefire that's been in place now for a few weeks to 60 days. It occurs to me that that's not going to prevent Iran from doing this again in the future. And indeed, as we look back on this conflict, I think what's perhaps most valuable to Iran is putting this in practice and seeing the havoc that they can wreak by closing this strait to ships from all over the world, the impact that that's had on the global economy. Do you have any confidence here that them having done that, this will be a one-and-done thing, that Iran won't return to this or try to do this again in the future? And indeed, how does the U.S. put in place any sort of procedure that would keep that from happening again?
Well, I think you bloody them badly militarily to show they cannot close the Strait of Hormuz cost-free. Look, anybody who reads a map can tell that the strait was a potential problem here. This was known in Trump's first term. I think history will record that his unwillingness or inability to see that and not to prepare for it in advance was one of the big mistakes of the operation. We knew, for example, we had to destroy as many of Iran's missiles as we could to prevent them from attacking our bases, Israel, our Gulf Arab allies, but we were late in the game in making sure that they couldn't close the Strait of Hormuz. If they get out of the current situation simply by diplomacy, I think it will lock in their minds that they can close the strait again by diplomacy and not suffer any real consequences. So I think reestablishing deterrence here means defeating the concept that they can just, on their say-so, act as if they're master of the strait.
Just to put a fine point on it, are you suggesting here the commander-in-chief is cartographically challenged, that he didn't think this through or didn't really understand the gravity of this when he entered into this conflict?
Look, in the first term, I tried to persuade him to adopt regime change as our objective in Iran, unsuccessfully, obviously. And we had discussions of it. Plenty of people participated. Closing the Strait of Hormuz is always one option that was available to Iran. I mean, we should consider that for decades, oil prices have had an implicit subsidy because nobody did try and close the Strait of Hormuz. Now that play has been made. Nobody can ever be doubtful that they would try and use it again in the future unless they thought it was just too dangerous for them to do it, which is all that this regime in Tehran today understands, that they'd be met by force and they'd be defeated.
I want to ask you about that regime because at the onset of this war, the president was saying that it was time for Iranians to rise up and overthrow the regime and
encourage them to do it.
Exactly, use that as one of the justifications for taking military action. I have several Iranian friends, some with families still in Tehran. They've suffered under this regime. They hate this regime, but they have also suffered under this conflict, and they do not seem to have the capacity or at this point the will, given what's going on, to even attempt such a thing. Is the current regime more or less the same level of extreme as the last regime? And do you think the president should have taken your advice and either not done it or gone all the way through and try to enact regime change in Iran?
Yeah, another mistake that the administration made before the start of the war is they didn't contact opponents of the regime inside Iran, with a few very minor exceptions. If Trump was determined not to use boots on the ground, then you need all the more to be coordinating with people inside who want to try and bring the regime down. That doesn't mean the people going out on the streets on the first day of the war. This regime massacred them in January. They'd massacre them again. That tells you how the regime feels about its own people. But given the destruction of the instruments of Iranian state power that our attacks represented, by working with the opposition inside, I think we could have gone a long way to bringing the regime down. But we didn't consult with them. We didn't say, how can we help you organize? What resources do you need? Do you need communications, money, weapons? What do you need? That requires planning. It probably requires time. We just didn't do anything. And I think we're on the verge of throwing away a great opportunity for more peace and security for us, for the Middle East, and God knows for the people of Iran.
We got a minute left. I want to ask you what confidence you have in those who are advising the president right now. I imagine you know some of the principals here, be that Steve Witkoff or Jared Kushner. You've interacted with them in the past. Are you confident that they have the kind of strategic know-how or sense to improve the situation that exists right now?
I don't think they understand the kinds of trade-offs they're making. For example, one of the most controversial aspects that's still very murky in this deal is whether the United States is going to unfreeze frozen Iranian assets and make available to them other resources. I think that would be a huge mistake. It's one thing to provide unfrozen assets to a real government in Iran that represents the people. If we provide this government frozen assets, it will entrench itself still further. And I don't think real estate brokers understand that that's what's at stake here. It's not about economic development in Iran for that money. It's about re-entrenching and enabling the regime to stay in power. That will be very bad politically for Trump if that's what works out.
Always good to get your perspective. Ambassador John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor to President Trump during the first term, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations as well. Thank you for your time on this Sunday.
And New Yorker cartoon aficionado.
Yeah, I did enjoy that, I must
Thank
say.
you, sir. All right, coming up, California heads to the polls Tuesday in a set of critical primaries. What to watch? We've got a bunch of people to break it down, and we're going to talk about where the numbers are at this moment. Keep us on your TV, on your radio, on your laptop, phone, however you're watching us digitally, or, of course, on the Bloomberg Business app. Bloomberg This Weekend. We'll be right back.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories. President Donald Trump says he would like to get a deal done, but he's in no hurry. In an interview on Fox News, he mentioned a few sticking points.
The one guarantee that I have to have is that there will be no nuclear weapons. They've agreed to that. And it was very interesting. They originally said, we will not develop a nuclear weapon. I said, well, what happens if you buy a nuclear weapon? So now it says we will not develop or in any way purchase a military weapon.
Well, Trump said that if the U.S. doesn't get what it wants, quote, we will end it in a different way. Meanwhile, President Trump is calling for the cancellation of a concert series celebrating the nation's 250th birthday this summer after a number of musicians pulled out. In a Truth Social post, he said, quote, we should have a giant Make America Great Again rally for 250 instead of having overpriced singers who nobody wants to hear. Now, it comes after another post by the president suggesting that he should instead headline the event, calling himself, quote, the man who gets much larger audiences than Elvis in his prime. In other news, 5 villagers have been rescued from a flooded cave in Laos after being trapped underground for over a week. Today, heavy rains, though, threatened to delay the search for 2 more people still missing. The 7 villagers, they entered the cave last week to look about for minerals, but were trapped by flash flooding. And today, security will be tight in New York City as the Israel Day Parade kicks off on 5th Avenue. A record turnout is expected. Not attending is Mayor Zohran Mamdani. NYPD Commissioner Jessica Tisch will be the Grand Marshal. Get ready for traffic, David.
A lot of traffic here in
Christina.
today. Lisa,
Yes.
thank you very much.
I am
Appreciate that.
right on that parade route and seemingly every parade
We'll
route.
have a short post-show meeting so you can get back.
When you choose apartments in New York, that should be part of the disclosure. Someone should have told me
Schools
this.
and parade routes.
I guess I could have Googled.
Important to know.
All right. Okay.
Lisa, thank you. We are coming up on another mini Super Tuesday this week with 6 states holding their primaries: California, Iowa, Montana, New Jersey, New Mexico, and South Dakota.
But we're going to zero in on the Golden
Not
State.
South Dakota?
No, we're sticking out of the Badlands. No Mount Rushmore for you today. What is South Dakota? I don't even know. The something state? You can Google that while I continue to
All
read.
right, sorry.
All right, there are big tests there for progressives and populists in both governor's race and a much-watched race for the LA mayor. No one knows this stuff better than our next 2 guests. That's Bloomberg opinion columnist Ron Brownstein and Erica Smith. They are both joining us from LA. Ron, I want to start with you. Can you set the stage for us? How do California primaries work, and where are we with all the people running, especially in the governor's race?
Yeah, as part of a wave of reforms when Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor, designed to make the state less partisan and more open to independent candidates, California voters approved a top 2 primary, sometimes called the jungle primary, where all the candidates in both parties and all parties run on the same ballot, and the top 2 advance to the general election. And that produces some really strange geometry in many of these races. We've seen Democrats at times promote Republicans to try to get them into the general election because, in a state where Democrats routinely get 60% of the vote, that's almost kind of a ticket to victory. And here we've gone from initially fears among Democrats that they would be locked out of the governor's race. It would be a top 2 Republican to now there's some fears creeping in among Republicans that they could be locked out of the governor's race, with the top 2 finishers being Democrats. So it really does change the kind of dynamics, the way candidates interact with each other. And I think it may have kind of outlived its usefulness in California.
The Mount Rushmore
really
state. South Dakota is the Mount Rushmore state. Just wanted to fact check that. Erica, let me turn to you and just ask you what we're seeing in the polling here. This is an odd or out of normal gubernatorial race in California where there is no clear frontrunner. Of course, the withdrawal of Eric Swalwell a few weeks ago changed the calculus entirely. But I'm curious what that says to you about the way voters are looking at this election. I imagine for this primary, turnout is going to be incredibly critical. What does past tell us about the way that voters are going to engage with this, and what does it mean that there is no clear frontrunner in the polling so far?
Yeah, you mentioned about Eric Swalwell dropping out of the race in April. I mean, since then, we've seen kind of really a consolidation that's only been, continued since then in the latest polling from last week. Basically, Javier Becerra, who served as health secretary under the Biden administration, has kind of really locked the lead for the Democrats. But, Tom Steyer, the billionaire former hedge fund manager, has now kind of in second, third place, depending on the poll. Steve Hilton, who is a Republican, is also kind of in the mix for number 2. So the question now, to Ron's point about whether or not we're going to see a Democrat and a Republican in the top 2, or a Democrat and a Democrat, which would be Tom Steyer and Javier Becerra, is really the choice. And I think that with voters, they're really looking for, I think one of the reasons Javier Becerra has risen to the top is people are really looking for experience. They're looking for a steady hand. Javier Becerra has been in state government. He's been in city government. He's been in the federal government. He's been at all levels. He's been in, people are looking for somebody who can walk in on day one and really get some issues done. But, there's also a number of people who are looking at Tom Steyer as somebody who has promised to tax billionaires, has taken on a lot of progressive, stances that people are really looking at too. So I think that's part of it. So I think the question for going forward as far as turnout is going to be is who's going to turn out, who they're going to vote for, what their politics are, and what they're ultimately looking for. But it does look like Javier Becerra kind of has the lead right now as far as most polls in the last month and a half or so.
Ron, we've also got this LA mayor's race. There's some familiar names, and then there's some less familiar names. You've got Spencer Pratt, Karen Bass, and this councilwoman who's running as well. It looks like, let's see if I can see that this far away, it's a little bit tight there at the top. I mean, we'll have to see what happens. Who has the wins, tailwinds behind them? And I would imagine the issues that are motivating people in the LA race are a little more specific, but probably universal to why Californians are going to the polls, and probably close to what we're seeing across the country as well, I would imagine. Tell me if I'm wrong. Yeah.
And very specific, yeah, and I think they overlap a lot with the governor's race. I mean, it is striking at times to hear the contrast between the way even Democrats are talking about kind of the trajectory of life in California and the way Governor Newsom talks about it. I saw Steyer yesterday at his closing rally. One of his closing rallies for governor was basically, if you're satisfied with, if you're satisfied with the status quo, you should vote for Becerra. Not exactly the message that Newsom is taking to the national stage as he prepares to run for president in 2028. And that really is even in more purified form in California, where you've got this kind of classic squeeze with the city council member Rahman from the left and Spencer Pratt, the reality TV show star from the right, kind of squeezing Karen Bass, who does not get great reviews from voters for her first term, particularly the handling of the Pacific Palisades fire. There is progress relative to when she came in on homelessness, but it's still, a serious problem in parts of the city. One-on-one, I would think she would still be favored against each of them. Aaron, I'd love to hear Erica's thought on that. The question again is, does she get squeezed out of the top two in this kind of, three-way race and not get to the general election? But I do think if she does get to the general election, either of those opponents just has too many vulnerabilities and potentially a ceiling that I would still consider her the favorite if she can get there to November.
Erica, let me bring you here in just a second, but first going to play a bit of sound of Spencer Pratt, of course, Mr. Heidi Montag, and purveyor of crystals from Pratt Daddy's Crystals, I believe is the company, and as Ron pointed out, a longtime reality TV star. Let's play a little bit of tape from him talking about the issue of homelessness in Los Angeles and how he would address it.
We, as a city, it's my tax money, so technically I'm as responsible. We all are letting these people die because we have city leaders like Mayor Bass and Rahman who are fine with them experiencing homelessness.
Eager to have you respond, Erica, to what Ron was talking about just a moment ago. But before we get there, explain the wind that is at Spencer Pratt's back right now. Why has he enjoyed such a run here in the days leading up to this election?
I really just think it has a lot to do with public anger at city government, right? I mean, I think that when Karen Bass came into office, 4 years ago, there was a lot of frustration with homelessness, a lot of the same issues that we see today: homelessness, housing, the cost of living. And she's addressed some of that, but not as fast and not as efficiently as a lot of people would have liked. And then on top of that, you have things like the Pacific Palisades fire and some other things that have popped up in the last 3 to 4 years. And so I think there's just an overall frustration. I think it's pent up, not just in her term, but I think it's over several years and multiple administrations, and people have just kind of had it. And I think that Spencer Pratt, as somebody who lost his home in the Pacific Palisades fire, has really given voice to that. And I think that that's a lot of what you see is in terms of his support, is just people just that are very, very angry.
I also want to ask you, Ron, about these meme ads that especially you've seen in support of Spencer Pratt. I don't want to do them a disservice. Can you describe what you're seeing in some of these ads and how you think they've resonated or not resonated with voters?
Well, look, I mean, as I say, in a primary, in this kind of primary, you're trying to get to 25%, right? I mean, that might get you a ticket to the general election. And he has certainly been very effective at capturing attention. I mean, there's still the fundamental reality of kind of a Trump-aligned Republican running in California is going to have a very hard time beating either of these women in a general election. But he has shown, it's kind of like the when if you only need to appeal to a small audience, this really resonates. The bigger the audience, the kind of the more diluted the effect of this kind of thing gets. But he has shown again that in the social media age, that kind of communication can, in many cases, be more valuable than the traditional, TV and cable ads that political consultants are used to putting up on the air.
Ron, let me draw an awkward segue here. I think we have Spencer Pratt, who is saying, look, you shouldn't care about my opinions on Donald Trump. My focus should be very local here on my potential constituents in Los Angeles. Let me go across the country to Maine, where you have Graham Plattner, who is kind of employing a similar tack. I think that there is an eagerness on his part to talk about Mainers in particular, to talk about what he would do for the state. He's not eager, especially to weigh in on a lot of national issues. Of course, in the last 24 hours, there's this New York Times reporting about salacious texts that he sent to other women besides, or excluding his wife, and what effect that might have on the campaign. I got to say, having talked to Mainers that I know, I don't don't know how much resonance this is going to have among them. I think that there is a clear differentiation that he's drawing between him and Susan Collins, the incumbent senator. Yeah. And Mainers seem very satisfied to have him as this kind of outsider, different kind of candidate. I'm curious sort of how you're looking at him in light of this latest tempest or scandal that's erupted here as a result of the Times reporting.
So much to say about this. By the way, another parallel, Janet Mills equal Karen Bass, right? Janet Mills, the governor, centrist establishment, longtime Democrat, kind of getting squeezed out on the left by Graham Plattner, who just overwhelmed her in the primary and reflects a kind of a view among many Democrats that they want more of a fighter, they want generational change and all of that. Having said that, Plattner has always been a lot riskier nominee for Democrats than Mills would have been. Susan Collins is the only Republican Senate candidate, challenger or incumbent, who won a race in Donald Trump's first term in a state where his job approval was net negative in the exit polls, where more people disapproved than approved of reform. She's the only one who won more than 8% of voters who disapproved of Trump, according to the exit polls. And so the job for Democrats in Maine is not really to mobilize some new, swath of voters or to persuade people to vote against Trump. It's to reassure people who are already inclined to vote against, the president. Now, 6 years later, after Collins won in 2020, it may be that Trump is so much more weakened, and that so is she after voting for Brett Kavanaugh and promising that he would not seek to overturn abortion, that anybody can beat her. But there's no question that Plattner, I think, gives Republicans more to work with in trying to convince the women, older women who are key to Collins's survival, that this is too risky a leap. So, yeah, I still say he's the favorite, but boy, this is going to be a rocky ride for Democrats.
Great to talk to both of you. Columnists both from California for Bloomberg Opinion. Ron Brownstein, Erica Smith, thank you very much for the time on this Sunday. And believe it or not, it has been 10 years since the Brexit referendum. A whole decade. How that vote impacted the world, that is coming up next on Bloomberg This Weekend, on Bloomberg Television, Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg.com, and on the Bloomberg Business app. Stay with us.
Thank you for joining us live on Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm Lisa Mateo. Let's update you on today's top stories and another big upset at the French Open. Coco Gauff's reign at Roland Garros ended in a shocking third-round loss to 28th seed Anastasia Potapova. Now, Gauff said that she felt she had failed to perform under pressure in those decisive moments. Well, the PGA tournament at Colonial Country Club, it enters its final day, topping the leaderboard. Eric Cole at 12 under par. That's followed by Ryan Gerard at 11 under par, and a tie in third between Mac Meisner and J.J. Spahn. Well, the NBA Finals, they are set. The Knicks will be playing the San Antonio Spurs. San Antonio beat the Oklahoma City Thunder last night in a Game 7, 111-103. Game 1 of the NBA Finals, that begins Wednesday night, and it will be a rematch of last time the Knicks made the finals when they lost to the Spurs in 1999. That's not going to happen. But we've heard so much about the high prices for tickets to the Knicks. But listen to this. World Cup suites in Mexico City, they're going for millions of dollars in a secret market on WhatsApp. A 27-seat suite that has one of the best views of the pitch is asking for $1.6 million for all 5 games being played at Banorte Stadium. Now, that's according to a post that was seen by Bloomberg. How is this all possible, you ask? But the stadium seats, they are private property because there was a 99-year ownership contract that was given to wealthy families who funded the construction back in the 1960s. And that allows them to resell or, there you go, rent out their boxes despite FIFA's rules against it. They're making some big money,
David
and
what is
Christina.
A real fan to do? I mean, New York is New York, and these Knicks tickets are very expensive, but it's hard to follow a team knowing you'll never get in.
I mean, it makes me sad. We used to go to farm team baseball games as
I see,
kids because they were,
minor
they were really affordable. But now even those have gotten crazy expensive. Yeah. I don't know. This is why
Try
I
go
have
to a Yankees game with your family.
Okay. They don't charge for Brutus when I take them places. All right, thank
Lisa,
you, guys.
thank you.
10 years ago, voters in the UK made a decision that reshaped not just the United Kingdom, but politics around the world. Brexit was sold as a way to restore sovereignty, control immigration, and unleash economic growth. But our next guest says it was, quote, a remarkable howl of self-defiance that was also an act of economic self-harm.
Adrian Wooldridge is a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. His latest piece for Bloomberg Weekend, co-written with Bloomberg's editor-in-chief, John Micklethwaite, is The Day That Changed the World. Adrian joins us now in New York. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Let's go back to that howl and how it's echoed around the world in the decade since. But we should start by saying this was wholly unexpected. And you point this out in the piece, that there was a lot of interest in the Brexit referendum, what might happen. Of course, politicians talked about it in the lead up to it, but I think the world was largely surprised that it came out the way that it did.
Well, it was unexpected in two ways. One, it was unexpected by the vast media sort of blob. People like me who covered
Mea culpa.
Yeah, I was going to say, of which we are guilty members, yes.
We did not expect it at all.
Yeah.
Partly because most of us live in London, and that was a sort of big centre of Remain, but partly we didn't sort of get to the north and talk to people up there enough, that the north being the big driver of that vote. But secondly, it was unexpected by the people who actually campaigned for it. And the look on the face of Boris Johnson and Michael Gove when they were told that they'd actually won was a look actually of horror, because they thought, actually, we've got to start running the country now, and we don't know what we're going to do.
I mean, the other political surprise is that it was put on as a referendum in the first place, that it was put up to the voters. Talk to us about how that decision came about and the fallout from that happening.
Well, the decision was a decision of party management. The big faction within the Conservative Party had been arguing very strongly that they needed a referendum. And in particular, a man called Jimmy Goldsmith created something called the Referendum Party. He was an eccentric billionaire, very successful businessman, but, you know, he lived in France, he lived in Mexico, he lived sort of everywhere apart from Britain, as far as I can see. And he created this thing called the Referendum Party, which stood in elections, particularly against Tory candidates. And he really frightened a lot of these Tory candidates. And these candidates started arguing, saying, we need to have a referendum. And David Cameron listened to this and said, actually, they're not going to win. Give them the referendum.
He thought this would put it to bed.
He thought it would put it to bed. He thought it was a tool of party management. And in fact, it was a tool of party destruction.
The economic ramifications were apparent pretty early on, if I remember right. This was going to be deleterious to the British economy, and yet it continued. And here we are today. As you look back on the last 10 years and the state of the UK economy today, directly attributable to what happened a decade ago?
Well, there are two complicated things. One is that there were people who argued that it would be good for the British economy.
I see.
They argued that it would be because it would free us to do what we wanted to do. We're a global trading nation. Europe has got big productivity problems. You know, we could be the Singapore on Thames. That was the argument that was presented by some Brexiteers. And some possibility that wasn't completely foolish. But what happens with two things. One was that they didn't really come in with a coherent plan of how to deliver those gains. And the second was the sort of world that Brexit created, which was a world of increasingly divided trading blocs, was exactly the worst sort of world for a free trading Britain to survive in. So they sort of shot their own goose, as it were.
One of those big motivators, I mean, there are huge parallels here with what happened in the U.S. a couple years later.
Absolutely.
Obviously, we didn't learn our lesson here, even after watching Brexit. One of the big motivators for those people in the North and folks that you say didn't get spoken to enough before this vote was immigration. And one of the interesting things that has happened is we do have a graph for those of us who can see. Our radio listeners, I'll walk you through it. But it shows a big spike in immigration after Brexit.
Absolutely.
Why are you seeing that, and what does that mean?
Well, there are two things that happened. It happened with immigration after Brexit. One is that it spikes, it actually goes up rather than going down.
Yeah.
And the second is it becomes browner. That before Brexit, a lot of the immigrants came from Europe. After Brexit, fewer and fewer come from Europe because the free market people, the visa issues, and more come from the Commonwealth. So if you voted for Brexit, hoping for a whiter country, essentially, which some people did, you got very disappointed. If you voted for Brexit, hoping for immigration control, you were also frustrated. So in some ways, the winners from Brexit turned out to be, in the long term, the losers. Why did that big surge in immigration happen? It happened partly because of COVID. And COVID created a lot of demand for labour, particularly in care homes and particularly in the National Health Service. And that labour is much more easily acquired from the Commonwealth countries than it is domestically. But secondly, that there were two groups of Brexiteers. One was the group of Little Englanders who wanted to restrict immigration, but the other was the group of globalists who said, well, Europe is this protectionist zone. We want a global Britain. And a global Britain means free trade in goods, it means free trade in money, but it also means free trade in people, means more immigration. And Boris Johnson, who was the leader of that wing of the Brexit movement, became Prime Minister and implemented his plan of of more immigration, which is now referred to as the Boris wave.
Regular readers of yours, I count myself among them, know that you like to think about history and historical sweep, and here we are 10 years out, a very small amount of time in the grand sweep of history. Do you see a world in which the UK is reintegrated into Europe in the way that it once was? How do you see this playing out in not the years to come, the decades to come, the centuries to come?
A very, very difficult question. I think there is now such doubt on the European continent about Britain. They're always a bit worried that Britain was a bit odd, an island nation and the rest of it. But I don't think Europe will really rush to readmit the British on the old terms because they think, well, they might leave again. You know, it's very, very close thing. Secondly, in order to join the European Union, we'd have to join the euro. We were in a rather good position in the past that we were sort of a member but not a member.
Always an interesting deal.
We had a very good
annoying
deal.
for those of us trying to travel and convert our pound. Also, the pound was always worth more than the dollar or the euro. But
But now they would say, well, you have to join much more on our terms. You have to accept the euro. You had all sorts of opt-outs under the old deal. You're not going to get those this time around. So I think if it comes to practice, we may move towards a world in which we're revolve a bit more closely with Europe, particularly when it comes to defence, perhaps when it comes to trading. But I don't see the old, what I thought was actually rather a good deal that Britain had, being recreated.
Lovely to see you here. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Adrian Wooldridge joining us here on set. You can find his piece, of course, on the Bloomberg terminal at bloomberg.com/weekend. Again, a remarkable 10 years that have passed since the day that changed the world, as he and John Micklethwaite put it in that piece for Bloomberg Weekend.
I really can't believe it's been 10 years. That
Wild.
seems so soon ago. But all right, that's fine. I'm getting old. It's great.
Speaking of getting old, Gen Z starting to avoid the bars, heading to the gym instead. But one of our Bloomberg reporters took us with her to investigate all of this, a crazy phenomenon here happening in the culture. I'm not one of these folks. Are you?
I am, sadly. I will say to somebody, I now, instead of saying, do you want to meet at a bar, I'll say, do you want to meet for a workout? Do you want to meet for a run? Do you want to meet for something healthy? Because it seems like a better choice.
One of us, at least, going that route. Take us with you no matter where you go. You can watch us on Bloomberg TV, listen on Bloomberg Radio, stream us live on the Bloomberg Business app. Wherever you are, we are there. It is Bloomberg This Weekend.
I'll be right back. I got to go for a run.
Welcome back to Bloomberg This Weekend. I'm David Gura.
I'm Christina Ruffini. All right, so right now the alcohol industry is taking a hit, with beer, wine, and spirit makers losing a combined $830 billion in market share from 2021 to 2025.
Yeah, and it turns out Gen Zers, they're actually looking to barbells over bar stools. You get it now, guys? Okay, for their social outlets. Bloomberg Pursuits journalist Sarah Rapport, she talked to me about it a few days ago.
It's both a health decision, and they're also looking for a community in places that they can't find at the bar, because more and more young people don't drink. So it's not just a health choice, it's a health choice and a choice to try and find more friends outside the office or the bar, really.
All right, I want to dig into that community aspect in just a bit, but I have to ask, because we're talking Gen Z and millennials, what about the Gen Xers and boomers? Where do we stand?
Well, the research shows that they're still going to the bar. They're still going to dinner. Maybe they're having dinner parties or house parties and owning homes. For the Gen Z who went to college perhaps in the pandemic and they had to work out from home with YouTube videos, they had to go to class on Zoom. They really want to go work out with other people. They're really into finding a community in a place that they can't because they maybe started their career remotely. So they're spending all this money on classes to find a community that they didn't have after graduating college.
So you talk about community. So is it more, socializing? Like, can they just go out and go on like a dating app? But no, they want to go and like be where the people are. I guess it is what you're leading to.
Yes, exactly. I spoke to a technology consultant who said she met her boyfriend at a run club, not at a dating app, not at a bar, but at a run club. And she made friends at Pilates. She goes to the same class every day. She compared it to school. She's said it was like sitting next to the same person week after week in a class. It was like being in college. And if you needed something to talk about, there's always the class, right? So it's like an easy icebreaker and a sense of familiarity and community that you just don't get elsewhere for them.
And aside from that, they're throwing parties there, like bachelorette parties. Like, this is the thing now.
I didn't have my bachelorette party at a Pilates
Me
studio.
neither.
I did something else. But yeah, they're telling me that they're hiring out the whole studios, spending thousands of dollars to rent out the equipment, have a teacher in, have mocktails instead of going to the bar. They'll bring their girlfriends to a Pilates class, which is kind of wholesome, I think.
All right, so you mentioned money. So how much are these Gen Z and millennials, how much are they spending on memberships, on classes, on things like that?
I spoke to one person whose budget was $800 a month on fitness, which is quite a lot of money. But they're outspending proportionally millennials and Gen X and boomers proportionally to their income on fitness, and spending more than last year in a Mintel survey as well. So it's growing. The trend seems to be nonstop. And part of it is that they can say that they feel better afterwards. Unlike going to a bar, there's no hangovers. There's no wearable like an Oura Ring or Whoop telling you your readiness score is lower the next day. They just feel better after a gym class.
Okay, it's good to feel that way. You don't want to have the hangover all the time. But they're doing all this and they're spending all this money when, rents are higher, when they're dealing with student debt. Like, how are they making this work?
I think it's a sort of like zero-sum game in their heads, as if maybe I can never afford a house, but I can put maybe a £200 or $200 membership on a credit card, right? So if they don't see long-term prospects, there's the risk of AI for their future. They might as well do something that makes them feel good in the short term. And I think gym spending is a big part of that.
It is. Now, in the article, you mentioned one thing that I want to point out. You talk about how wellness has become a full-fledged identity. Now, I know my social media feed, it's filled with, people working out. It's, what am I meal prepping for the week? Like all these different things. I mean, does social media have a lot to do with it too, about more people going, or these younger generations going to the gym?
Yeah, I do think there is a performative aspect with like the hashtag Pilates on TikTok, the clean girl aesthetic, or people wearing their matching $200 Pilates sets and wanting to look the part. I think that is a really big part. I spoke to a content creator in Atlanta who's 23, and she documents all of her gym sessions. She's made friends at the gym, but she's also made it her business online, like her content creation arm. So I think the lifestyle aspect and the way that social media has really driven that, wanting to look a certain way and perform a certain way online, is huge.
Okay, go back to me. The clean girl, what is it? Explain that one to me.
Yeah, the clean girl look is like athleisure and wearing less obvious makeup.
Okay,
yeah, it's sort of a as opposed to the millennial, I would say like Kesha aesthetic, if that makes sense to you. It's a different one, wanting to look more like wellness oriented, as if instead of you just got back from the bar.
Okay, got it. And last question, do GLP-1s, does that have anything to do with this as well? Does that play into the picture?
I think it does. That didn't come up so much in the research. But people who are on GLP-1s are told to strength train as part of that regimen. So I think that could be, as more younger people get on GLP-1s, as it becomes more mainstream, and wanting to strength train to keep up that as part of the medicine, I think that'll be a really big ongoing part of this trend to keep it going into the future.
All right, I work out in my basement. I don't even go to the gym. So this seems like, it's a big social thing. But are people still going to the bars? Like, how are bars and restaurants doing?
Bars and restaurants are making menus that cope with people who are on GLP-1s, so more small plates, smaller portions, mocktail options. I've seen a lot of more creative mocktails now for people who aren't drinking. So I think there, of course, is a space for bars and restaurants. I, for one, enjoy a nice bar dinner out. But I think that hospitality, especially like hoteliers and business owners, need to find a way to make a community in the way that the gyms are killing it at, to really get that Gen Z spend at the moment.
I got it. I'll meet you at happy hour, Sarah. Sarah Rappaport.
I'll join you. It sounds great. We can have a mocktail and do a Pilates class.
Totally. Bloomberg Pursuits. Thank you so much. So, David, Christina and I have decided that we're going to go to a class. Yes.
Yeah.
Are you going to join?
No, I'll have a cocktail and skip the Pilates class, but I hope you guys have a great time. Whenever that transpires, I'm eager to hear about it.
It'll be great. You don't want to come and hang out and do some, hundreds with us?
No. Thank you very much for joining us on Bloomberg This Week, and be sure to tune this Friday at noon, Wall Street time, for the premiere of Bloomberg Money with Tom Keene and Scarlett Fu. Stay with us.